I hope everybody is having a wonderful morning. Um, seen people stating a few things lately about out of Africa and about it being debunked, and so I thought we could talk about it and see if we can figure out why people seem to think it's or what has been debunked about out of Africa, and B, maybe get some more information on what this actually means and more information on our newest understanding of how we see the start of us. I'm going to try and get the live out a little bit. We seem to be having very little I think I did something and shadow banned myself. I think when I downloaded the TikTok Studio for my laptop, that it actually shadow banned me, and I'm not sure why. So I'm going to be sharing the live. I'm going to ask everybody, please, to share the live as much as possible. And I'm going to ask for many likes, and I don't normally do that, but I am trying to see why and what's going on. It seems like uh, I've been in an account warning before and been more visible. So we're going to go ahead and touch on a few things with what this means. And touch on a few things about the new information that we have coming out about how our species starts and develops as a species. I think this is important because I think that we see currently a lot of this understanding or thought process that like there's a lot of argument that this means something that it doesn't actually mean. And that argument, I think, is being used to, I think for some people, they're using that argument to try and protect themselves. And I totally understand that and totally get that. Not a leftist, not a rightist. I am a rightist. Two wings, same bird. Your government is out to kill you from both sides. And when the Republicans tell you it's the leftists that are trying to kill you and not them, they're really doing a sleight of hand on you, and they're really kind of screwing you over. So instead of thinking that it's the other side out to get you, maybe understand that it's your government that doesn't give a flying fuck about you, right? So, just so you know, it's not a leftist, it's not a rightist. Two wings, same bird. Neither one of them give a flying about you. Neither one of them are going to take care of you. Both of them are out to hurt you. And they're both trying to hurt you while telling you it's the other side that's trying to hurt you. So that you, instead of seeing that they're trying to hurt you, decide to attack somebody else instead of actually going for what's actually out to get you, right? You know that. You really do. We all know that. We really do. Some of us have just bought into the idea that really it's only one side of our government, that the other side of our government really loves us. It's trying to take care of us. But let's be real. Do you really think that either side of your government has done anything useful for you in the last 20 years? I mean, I'd like you to kind of name to me one useful thing that either side of the United States government has done for you in the last 20 years. But if you keep up with the thought process that, oh my God, it's the leftists, or oh my God, it's the rightists, really what you're going to do is just continue to allow yourself to be destroyed because it is the government and both sides of the coin that are trying to hurt you, right? So, you can continue on that line if you want to. I'm not sure what about anything makes you think that I'm a leftist. And I do have to say that in the United States, nobody's a leftist in the United States. Nobody's far enough left. We have moderates in the United States, and we call them leftists. Just saying. So when we're looking at some of the newer evidence that we're seeing coming across out of research in DNA, research with ancient DNA, understandings of different things coming across in finds and fossils and stuff like that, we're starting to see that there's a lot broader of a creation of our species than we really thought in the beginning, right? That the creation of our species comes at a wider start, not a wider start. The word in my head is not the right word. and I'm not. It's not correct, and I can't think of the word that I need for it. But really, we start at a broader scale of humans, right? Like there's more humans coming together to start us than I think, or that we have thought in the past. This is all new information that's coming out. That's what this article here from archaeologist.org is about. And really, what it is showing us that we are actually quite a bit more diverse than we tend to think of, and that we are actually, see if I can find this the right way, that in our huge diversity that we actually have, that huge diversity that we actually have um, really gives us the ability to kind of go further than we think, kind of take things further. It's kind of how we get to this point that we're able to really spread across the globe. What are the splitters and the lumpists, Ducray? I'm not exactly sure what the splitters and the lumpists are to start with. Um, there it is. Okay, I'm going to post this. This will be on the Google website. I'm putting it up right now. The picture that this comes from is from a new um, new article, new finding, and this has come out a lot over the last week. I've seen quite a few articles on. They are turtle earrings. I honestly can't remember which person. I think her name is Jessica Combs, but I'm not exactly sure which sister I know that made these. I have so many different earrings from so many different people. But I had asked specifically for some turtle earrings with some abalone in the center of them because I have a love for turtles. And then, of course, abalone, all the things from the sea is really important to me. That rhymed more than I wanted it to. And so these I got a couple years ago. I am absolutely in love with them. I actually will. I need to go and find out where I got. I know which ones I got a lot of them from, or but double down on who I got what from, and maybe do some show of some of my earrings with the people that you can contact to get some of the earrings. So are there examples of partially fossilized remains, 50% organic and 50% stone? No, not when it comes to human remains. So far, the things that fossilized that we have that have turned into stone, and I know that most of us think of fossil as something that's turned into stone, but when we look at ancient human remains, we call them fossils, even though they haven't turned to stone. When we look at things that have turned to stone, most things that have turned to stone are a couple of million years in the making of the turning into stone, and most of them are trees. That's mainly most of the things that we see turned into stone. We'll see things like amber is like tree sap that turns into stone, right? But you absolutely see that awesome sleepy. Have a good night. I hope it's sweet. When we see things turning to stone, they don't tend to be humans. Like, and I think that it's in part, though we do have human fossils or hominin fossils from like 7 million years ago, and they haven't turned to stone. So I'm not exactly sure what it is that actually gives us that turn to stone. What process that turns trees into stone or sap into stone? But we do not see kind of the same process happen with human remains to any knowledge that I've seen so far or anything. Because I've asked, like, what do you mean by fossil? Does that mean we've turned to stone, right? Because to me, that's what fossil meant for the longest time, right? But actually, when we are talking about human remains, when we're talking about the fossilization of human remains, we're just talking about them being ancient. We're not talking about them actually turning to stone. To my knowledge, we don't have any human remains of or hominin remains or animal remains that have turned to stone. Even things like when we look at fossils like of ancient like tetrapods and things like that, when we're looking at those fossils, what we're looking at is not the remains of the animal that's turned to stone, but the imprint of the animal on the stone surroundings. So, like if the animal died and was covered with sand, and then that sand solidified into stone, then that imprint of the animal is in that, but the animal itself is not a fossil. Like the animal itself has dissolved. It's just its imprint that's left. Um, I do not think we even have dinosaur bones that have turned to stone, to my understanding. But again, I don't do dinosaurs. I don't really do anything pre-human, so I'm not positive on that. That's just to my understanding. Give me 1 second. And it is. It's saying genetically distinct groups across Africa. This is the latest information in the understanding of the origin of our species. Um, this article has come across in a couple of different ways in a couple of different journals. I chose archaeologist.org because I like the archaeologist.org. When we're looking at this new information kind of gives us just a broader understanding of how we're coming about. So, what it's talking about with this new understanding is this idea that we start roughly 300,000 years ago as a hominin, Homo sapiens species, uh, and yet it's not till roughly 130 to 120,000 years ago. Let me double check the dates because this is so new that I'm still trying to understand some of it. This model predicts that after two or more slightly genetically distinct Homo populations have been mixing for hundreds of thousands of years, the earliest population split among early humans that is discernible in modern populations took place 120 to 135,000 years ago. People continue to move between the stem populations after the population split, resulting in a weakly structured stem. So, what this basically is talking about is the idea that we start from a few different lineages of Homo erectus. Now, it does specify in this. Uh, these numerous lineages were likely morphologically similar due to migration between them, which means morphologically different hominid fossils, such as Homo naledi, are unlikely to represent branches that helped evolve Homo sapiens, according to these authors. Now, this is something we were talking about before. Is when we see what Homo naledi has in its brain structure compared to what we have in our modern brain structure compared to what early Homo sapiens brain structure was, does that actually mean that like Homo naledi is one of the species that we start out from? But this is saying that they don't think that the morphologically different species contribute to our start. So this would mean really that we've got several groups of Homo heidelbergensis, which we've talked about in here, several groups of Homo heidelbergensis and Homo erectus, or maybe other subspecies that aren't morphologically different of Homo erectus, right? So Homo heidelbergensis and Homo ergaster and Homo rudolfensis are only slightly morphologically different in the skull structure, to my memory and understanding. And so you might have that morphological difference in the skull structure, whereas Naladi is morphologically different, but like in its entire upper body, because Naladi takes its L spine up back to Lucy, and its L spine down stays with Homo erectus, right? So this is going to be a completely morphologically different species. Whereas we might find some skull differences in things like ergaster or heidelbergensis or rudolfensis. That skull structure is really the major difference. Maybe some of the fingers are curved a little bit differently, but not that major structural difference that we see of Australopithecine versus Homo, right? So, what this is basically saying is that you're taking two or more of these ancient Homo populations, descendants of Erectus, populations of Erectus, parts of Erectus that are in South Africa. And this space within South Africa, absolutely, Carbon. This place within South Africa is giving, and I've described it before as think of your nation that has several different bands in it. And you visit and you, like maybe there's a yearly gathering, right? We saw, if anybody has read or listened to or watched Clan of the Cave Bear, there's an example of this in there where you see that all the bands gather together once every like 5 years, and they share and they talk and they swap and they, give each other new technology, and there's going to be a genetic exchange there. So think of it in similar ways that you have a large group of people that pretty much encompasses, and this article is actually talking about it encompassing all of Africa. And I've heard before that it is the Kwai population of South Africa that has the highest genetic diversity, but this article, and this might be changes in our understanding of the genome, actually names the Nama people as having the most genetic diversity. So again, this could be something that I was taught it was the Kwai people, but it could be something that shifted as our genetic understanding, as our genomic understanding has been broadened with the later tests that we have, with the newest information that we have, right? So if that's the case, this is telling us that currently our understanding is that the Nama people actually have the most genetic diversity of anybody that we have as a human population. Um, and again, this could mean that the Kwai people did before. It could mean that the Nama are a sub people or like a part of the Kwai people, and the Kwai is the broader nation, right? And the Nama is the space within the Kwai. I don't know enough about populations of Africa and who belongs to what group to know that myself, right? So when we're looking at that, it really tells us that, uh, again, when we can trace that genetic diversity to the space that has the most genetic diversity, what we're tracing to is the origin population or one of the founding populations of our species, one of the starting populations. Because if we're looking at someone or a population that shows all the genetics and all the genomes of a species, we've talked before about how, say Homo sapien has 100 different genomes or genetics, like 100 different genetic codes. It's obviously thousands more. I think it's like 25,000, but I can't remember. Um, Obviously more, but say they have 100, right? And every person gets 25, and every group of 100 has all 100 genomes, right? So if you have a group of 200 and 100 leave Africa, they're taking that full genome out of Africa, but as they split up and go to different places, they're taking parts of the genomic full with them, right? So parts of that full 100, and it might be like 1 through 95, right? But there's still like 5 genomes that they're not taking with them. So when we find a space that has all the genomes or all the genes, and I might be saying genes and genomes in the way that this works slightly off, okay? But when we find a place that has the greatest genetic diversity, therefore all the genetics, we're looking at the place where we as a species are really originating, because they're the ones that have it all. And as you migrate out, you take less and less with you, right? So that's one of the things that I want to talk about. This doesn't, and nobody has debunked the out of Africa hypothesis. When people talk about debunking the out of Africa hypothesis, what they are talking about debunking is this idea that at 100,000 years ago, Homo sapien leaves Africa and never returns. The debunction of the out of Africa hypothesis only debunks a singular exit and exodus both work, only debunks the idea that there is one exodus outside of Africa. The out of Africa hypothesis, as in we all start in the same space, right? Our species comes from the same hole, right? And has migrated out, has not stopped. That is 100% our understanding to this day. What we have debunked is that that exodus only happened once. We now know that Homo sapiens leave and live in the Levant area, in the Arabian Peninsula, and in that lower part of Southwest Asia. Not all of it, but in the ice-free temperate zones, starting roughly 100,000 years ago or 150,000 years ago. And we now know that that's not the only time. Like, so we've talked a lot about here before, talked a lot in here before about the fact that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens lived side by side in two caves in the Levant for roughly 100,000 years, from roughly 150,000 years ago to 50,000 years ago. Now, in this time, it is understood that we go back into Africa. We come back out, we go back in. We come back out, we go back in. So when people are talking on a scientific level on out of Africa being debunked, what people are talking about is the fact that the idea that we left Africa as a huge group 100,000 years ago, and everything that we've gone through since, and all of the changes that we've made in different spaces, therefore really matter because they're really impactful to our genes, is debunked. We have always, always, always moved. It is one of the things that is unique to us. The only other species that did what we do is Homo erectus. And I mean that by migration. I don't mean all the other stuff. The Homo erectus is fucking brilliant. Um, the only other species of Homo, the only other species of animal, with the exception of like ants, that has really done what we do, and even ants don't do it as much like we do, right? We start in the same space. You have to start together to be able to breed, period. There's just no other way. You got to find me something that debunks that before you can convince me, because every scientific evidence that we currently have, and again, and I will always tell you, this is current, doesn't mean that it can't change tomorrow. And if you can show me something that says that we could not, that we could breed this easily being separate species, or that that one species will originate in 2 or 3 different locations, completely unique and isolated from each other, and still be able to breed. If you can show me that, I'll look into it. But currently, we know that speciation comes when you have one species that isolates from each other and becomes 2 separate species. And that when 2 separate species isolated from each other get back together and meet, if they have a recent common ancestor, they can absolutely have sex. Not a lot of offspring, and most of the offspring that they have is not viable. The offspring that they have is viable to adult, has a tendency to be infertile. Every once in a while, you will get a fertile offspring. We know this about when any group originates in 2 different locations, that they cannot breed easily. And sorry, y'all, but we like rabbits. Let's be real. And we breed like rabbits. Let's be real. And not only that, but yes, some people are infertile. This happens. Unfortunately, it is a sorrow. For some, it's actually probably what they're wanting or needing, right? There is infertility that is a blessing and infertility that is a curse, right? As a whole, we're not infertile. And unless 2 infertile people meet in a coupling of, it's not the coupling that makes it infertile. It's a singular part of that coupling. And that other part of that couple can go somewhere else and not be infertile, right? It's not the coupling that makes it infertile. So when we look at species of crossbreeding like horses and donkeys, we know that if you take a fertile donkey and breed it to any other donkey, it's not going to have a problem. You take a fertile horse and breed it to any other fertile horse, and it's not going to have a problem. You put the horse and the donkey together, and it's going to be an inviable pregnancy. Or if it's in a pregnancy that lasts, sometimes it won't grow to adulthood. If it grows to adulthood, it is most likely infertile, and like 1 in every 500 or so mules is actually fertile and then is female and must be bred back to the male that bred it. Usually, I believe that it is a male donkey and a female horse, and then it has to be bred back to the male donkey. Could be wrong. Haven't lived on a farm breeding animals that were horses or an equine in decades at this point, so I could have that memory a little bit backwards. But when we look at these things, we see that we must all be the same species. And because we must all be the same species, we had to start in the same space. Had to. Um, like one of those laws that we understand currently. Now, again, something could come out tomorrow. It could change this. And if it does, I'll bring it in and go, holy shit, guys, did you see this? And if you've seen something that tells me differently, that shows a difference in that, please bring it to me. Right. But this is our current understanding. And so our current understanding is that we absolutely 100% have to be one species, and we absolutely 100% therefore have to start in the same space, because speciation is dependent on the adaptations that we take to the space that we live in. Okay. So the way that we speciate, the way that we become a unique species, the way that any species becomes unique is by adapting in isolation to the space that they are in. And when you adapt in isolation to the space that you're in, you adapt to the point that you're unlikely to be able to breed with anything else, uh, unless you have a recent common ancestor, right? And again, that recent common ancestor, like with equines, allows the breeding, but doesn't allow for easy viability, doesn't allow for viability, doesn't allow you to get pregnant easily, doesn't allow a viable child to happen easily, right? I don't really call out people's names a lot if you're new here. I don't want you to think that it's not that I see you. It's that I'll get distracted real fucking easy and I will lose track of my thoughts. So if I just kind of continue my focus, then you'll get the most out of me. If I'm answering everybody or I'm looking at everybody or I'm, hey, everybody, it will distract me and you will never get what you're trying to get out of this pace of time. I'll be here for 3 hours and we'll just be bullshitting. So I'll wave at you and I definitely see you or I'll smile at you. I just want you to take that to the fact that it is me just really trying to maintain my focus as a Widda, a Sarah, a human, and having those problems. So, when we're looking at that, to have that viability, we absolutely have to have adapted in the same space. We absolutely have to have speciated in the same space and to be from the same space. One of the things that Homo erectus have that we have, and not just you, just I saw a TikTok the other day that was like, if you really want to engage with your people, you need to be doing this. And I'm like, shit, we'd never stop talking. That's not what we're here for. So when we're looking at Homo erectus or the other species that has that ability to go around the globe, right? That ability to move around the globe, that's a very unique thing with us, right? You can think of ants as like Homo erectus that have, gone across the globe and then adapted into different spaces. This is how you get like the red ant, and you get like the fire ant, and you get like the ants that eat you, and just different things like that. This is because these ants have adapted in different spaces, right? And they all start from a singular ant population, really, or at least if you take it far enough back, right? So Homo erectus does the same thing. Homo erectus goes around the globe. Homo erectus, going around the globe, isolates in specific spaces and speciates in specific spaces. Now, again, most of the time we look at this as Homo heidelbergensis, Homo ergaster, and there's a couple others that we see that have been both in Africa and outside of Africa, to my understanding, when it comes to these Homo species that are what many consider to be subspecies of Homo erectus, or a part of the overall of Homo erectus. We do not have DNA. We do not have genetic evidence on these species. What we have is skeletal morphology. And we see species that have a very different skeletal morphology, basically. Not skeletal, spatial skull morphology. And we take those skull morphologies and decide that they're different species. So some people will call them all different species, and some people will call them all subspecies of Homo erectus. I go with the latter. My teacher went with the latter. The people that taught me, that's what I've seen the most of. So when we're looking at that, we see that as Homo erectus, as a heidelbergensis or gaster or rudolfensis and stuff makes it across the globe, we see that as they make it across, they get to these specific spaces and they isolate in these specific spaces for 1,000,000 years sometimes. And in that isolation in those spaces for that long, they develop new species. Now, we know now that we mixed with many of these species and that we have admixture from many of these species. This does not, though, change the fact that Homo sapien starts in Africa. Now, this new information tells us that it is a broader space of Africa. It might even be all of Africa, though I'm a little, again, I'm kind of confused as to what some of it is saying. Not that I'm confused, but like, okay, is it saying this or is it saying that? Because it's so new and I haven't been able to like parse it together. It's also been a really fucked up head time in my life. So I haven't been able to parse it together very well. So let me look at something really quick. I just want to double check. I know it said something about different populations in East Africa and in West Africa. It might have been in a different article. I'm not seeing it in this one, so I'm not even going to play with that. We're going to stick with what I've known or what I've been told, uh, and what the other articles that I had read had said. This is the one that I've read in the last 2 days is the only one that I've seen that said anything about outside of South Africa, like East Africa or West Africa, right? So, and I'm not seeing it in this one. It must have been in a different article I was reading about something else, and I correlated it. So, when we're looking currently, our understanding is it is South. When we're looking at this, what we're understanding is again, we're looking at a large nation with several different bands. And I would like to remind you the difference between tribe and band. Tribe means a group of or a community based on genetic lineage, based on they all have the same grandmother and they all have different, like this aunt and this aunt and this aunt all create these families. And they like say you have an aunt named Ant, and you have an aunt named Stone, and you have an aunt named um, Ochre, right? So your aunt named Ant might actually create a family line that is a clan based on the ant, right? Your aunt named Stone might have a family line or a clan that is based on stone, and your aunt named Ochre might have a family line or a clan based on ochre. And if you look at these things, you might embody the ant into your body paint, and this could be your group. Erectus isn't really doing body paint. We don't get to self-decoration until we get to Neanderthals and sapiens. And you have your stone group, and maybe they're all wearing a stone at some point on their body, right? And maybe the head of the group ends up with like a stone headdress, right? And then you have self-bred because ogre, right? So when you're looking at this, what you're looking at is a tribe is familial lineage. You have your matriarch here and her three daughters and their created family lines and clans and groups. And this could encompass up to hundreds of people, right? As time goes on, as lineage goes on. When you're looking at a band, what you're looking at is groups that are genetically distinct from each other, forming a single community. So a band might have a group of Denisovians and a group of Neanderthals and a group of Homo sapiens, which we seem to see in Denisova Cave, right? That we have a band living of three genetically unique species who are working together in harmony, right? So this is the difference between a tribe and a band. And when we're looking at this idea of, or this knowledge that we're all originating in South Africa, but we're originating in South Africa in a larger, broader genetic makeup, what we're looking at is the likelihood that there is, so say you are looking at Homo erectus, the species that stays in Africa, in South Africa, as a nation, right? And within that nation of Homo erectus, say that you have several different bands, and those bands might even be speciesations, right? Like subspecies. Like maybe you have a band of Heidelbergensis, and maybe you have a band of Ergaster, and maybe you have a band of Rudolfensis, right? And then within the bands of Rudolfensis and Heidelbergaster, you have smaller bands, right? So you have your nation and then your state and then your bands, right? And every year the nation meets, or there's a constant migration between because you're constantly following different groups, several different states, all all hunt berries in the sorry, I know that froze for a second. So several different states all hunt berries in the same space every spring or every fall, right? And so you have several different bands going to the same space to gather berries every fall. And in that several different bands going to the same space to gather berries every fall, somebody from this tribe meets somebody from that tribe, and we're like, and you get it on, right? And they maybe come with us and they move along. So there's this constant genetic flow. This really totally is understood within our understanding of Homo erectus as well, anyways. The reason that we think that these might be subspecies of Homo erectus or Castor rudolfensis and heidelbergensis and like 14 others is because we often find their skeletons in the same space. And when you're finding skeletons prior to burial, which is like 9,000 or 900 90,000 years ago, too many different numbers in my head, with the exception, of course, of Naladi. But when we're finding these skeletons, what we're finding is you're going to have like two or three ergaster and a couple of heidelbergensis and a couple of erectus and a couple of rudolfensis all living in the same space when a cave collapses on them. And so you know that they're living together, you know that they're together, right? And that is why many people tend to think of these as all being subspecies of Homo erectus because they're all living together. They're all a part of each other, which means that there's going to be a lot of genetic interchange, anyways. So if you have all of these groups and they're already all living together in these larger, genetic interchanges, anyways, and then you get it larger and larger and larger, we're looking at what is happening when we're starting in South Africa. Again, currently our understanding is that it is South Africa, and it is South Africa on a broader scale. It's not just like the Rising Star Caves in South Africa, right? It is definitely a broader scale of South Africa, right? And absolutely getting along. We tend to think of infighting and hating each other and othering each other as a natural thing for our species. It is not. It is not. It is unnatural for any species to do things that are antithetical or in opposite of their survival. And it is absolutely in opposite of their survival. I've actually been on pretty much every day for the last week and a half since last Sunday. I've been on except for like 2 or 3 days because I, took a couple days off over the weekend. I've actually been on. I don't think like I think I'm shadow banned again. I think I'm shadow banned. That's the only thing I can figure. Like I'm not in an account warning, and less people are seeing me not in an account warning than it was getting seen in an account warning. But I am here, I am back, and I am trying to go live pretty much every day of the week, like Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Probably take a day off in between those, or maybe Friday off, and then Saturdays I'm off doing fun things and family things. But I am trying to be here in the morning Pacific Standard Time every day of the week right now, or roughly every other day of the week. So if you're not seeing me, keep an eye out. I will try and post the times. I was planning on going live this evening, but I will try and then that's why I didn't post a live event. But I will try and post some live events so that people see them. But if you're not like if it's just not coming across your feed, if it's in Pacific Standard Time morning, yeah. Oh, well, that's good. That's a great place to be. Black Talk is an amazing place. Um, so when we're looking to get back to when we're looking at that with Homo erectus and its start, or what we understand of Homo erectus, anyways, we're looking at multiple groups, anyways. We're looking at the genetically diverse space, anyways. We're looking at bands who are intermixing. So what this tells us with the modification of our origin, what it's telling us is that we're no longer coming from a singular group in Africa. What is telling us is that, say, the lake bed in Chad, right, is where the original population was believed to have come from before. I'm not exactly sure because they debunked that. Oh, I understood it differently a while ago, anyways. So when we're looking at that, we're looking at it's not just a singular location, it's a broader location. Take everything sub-Saharan, basically. And of course, there wasn't sub-Saharan at the time. This doesn't exist. Uh, The tropical line that goes across Africa has moved up and down throughout its existence and has changed it's the storm line going through, and it creates the trees and the heavy green spaces in Africa, and that's kind of moved up and down anyways. And I'm not exactly sure where it was 300,000 years ago. I do believe that it was actually down a little lower, but we're looking at most of South Africa anyways. When we're looking at this again, what we're looking at is taking a nation with many different bands, again, not genetically linked groups, tribe is genetically linked within it. And they are constantly, not even constantly, but they are intermingling. Now, again, this can be through migration, this can be through trade. This can be through everybody gathers once a year, right? This can come about in many different ways, but it is definitely a constant genetic intermix. And that constant genetic intermix within the group of people creates a greater genetic diversity within us specifically. Now, this greater genetic diversity is in relation to things like Naladi, Neanderthal, Denisovian, Florensis, Luzonensis, right? The other things the other human species that come out of the species that we come out of, right? So if you take it to the idea that we're looking at Homo ergaster and Homo heidelbergensis and Homo rudolfensis and all of those other non-morphologically different species, kind of giving that intermix, right? Whereas outside of Africa, the only thing that's going up into northwest or northeast, it is west, northeast Eurasia is Heidelbergensis. So it's only taking one hominin group up into northwest Eurasia, right? And that is narrowing the genetics that go to the creation of Neanderthal. Whereas we create with more than one human group, you're not seeing that Neanderthal creates with more than one human group. We've talked before about how this narrow genetic within Neanderthal and with all the species that originate outside of Africa really is part of their downfall, really is part of the reason that they aren't here anymore. And I would like to remind people that Neanderthal was here 300,000 years when we came into being. So, like, they've doubled our time here on Earth. So, when we say not here anymore, it's not like we're going to be here in 300,000 years. I mean, we might not be here in 300,000 years, especially with the way that we're fucking going, right? So, I don't want people to take it as a failure of Neanderthal to have subsisted for 300,000 years longer than we have, right? I do want this understanding, though, that Neanderthal being so genetically, with such a lack of genetic diversity towards the tail end, and again, 570,000 years at this point, right? So, say I think we see that the earliest DNA that we have currently of Neanderthal is like 400,000 years ago, I believe, 300,000 years ago, and it has a DNA that is a Y DNA of Denisovian, that's more closely related to Denisovian than to Neanderthal in its genetics. And then after 200,000 years, or can't exactly remember the date. I know it's roughly around 200,000. It starts with 200,000. I remember that. We start to see the Y DNA because we only have like 4 Y DNAs of Neanderthals, 4 Neanderthals that have Y DNA. So when we see that, we start to see this shift into the Y DNA of sapien. This is showing, it can show a number of things and we don't exactly know, right? But it does show a lack of Y DNA from Neanderthals pretty early on, which could show a lack of genetic diversity that therefore is taken over by Denisovians. We didn't know that Denisovians went back that far. It could be that the Y DNA that's Denisovian and more similar to Denisovian actually shows that Denisovians are a result of a split of Neanderthals, like a descendant of the male lines of Neanderthals. Maybe, right? It could show a few different things. But when we get to the end of Neanderthal, we see that whatever they had started out as, they're extremely genetically narrow. When we're looking at that, our current understanding is that they started out more genetically diverse, though not more than us, and that they went through two almost extinction phases, and that narrows their genetic diversity. So, getting to that narrowness of genetic diversity isn't necessarily because they started with a narrower genetic diversity than us. It has a lot of different in plays within it. When we get to these other species, though, we do see that the genetic diversity is less than our genetic diversity. And I do believe that when we look at that, it really comes about, and these kind of articles actually kind of double down on that. It really comes about that we have a greater genetic diversity because we have more groups of humans interchanging that genetic diversity. Again, this does not change the fact that all of these groups of human are in Africa and to our current knowledge in South Africa, right? And it is just the fact that we've constantly moved. Again, that is the thing about Homo erectus that made Homo erectus unique, that gave Homo erectus the ability to go across the globe and speciate into Neanderthal, Denisovian, Naladi, Florensis, the ghost species in Turtle Island, the ghost species in Australia. The ability to go around the globe and do that really comes from the really great expedient bipedalism that we see within erectus. And really, if we look at the fact that we consider so many species to be subspecies of erectus, it really comes from a genetic diversity within erectus. Now, I can't double down on a genetic diversity. We have no DNA from erectus, right? We cannot get DNA from erectus so far. So it's not like we have a genome. But our understanding when looking at things like having different facial morphologies or skull morphologies all living together gives us an idea of a genetic diversity. So that gives us the idea that it is not just that expedient bipedalism and just the understanding of how to control fire and just the tool usage and just, that gives them the ability to go everywhere, including crossing water, but it is also that genetic diversity that gives them the ability to take those genes out. And we do like we believe that Florensis comes from ergaster, which again is a subspecies of erectus, right? Just like we believe that Neanderthal comes from Heidelbergensis, which is a subspecies of erectus. We have chosen who we think Denisovian comes from, but I can't remember off the top of my head who it is, but I do know that it's not Heidelbergensis, right? So we do know that all of these subspecies of erectus, with erectus most likely, because we see erectus across the globe, are moving out, right? And as they move out, their isolation in adaptation is creating these different species. Again, speciation comes from isolation in adaptation. Set it back. Isolation. If you're isolated and you're surrounding, if you don't adapt, you don't change, right? You don't speciate. If you don't isolate, again, you have all of that genetic intermix and interflow, so you don't speciate into a new species that is distinct, right? Uh, you might create an evolution of your species that is different than the prior evolution of your species. Like Homo sapiens starts out with a head shape like this, and now we have a head shape like this, right? So you might create a different you might create an evolution that looks different than the prior evolution of your species, but you are not going to see an evolution that makes you completely genetically distinct from the species that you evolved from, right? And when you have that higher mix, that higher amount of several different groups mixing together, that really takes it much further and gives that greater genetic diversity, which is really what gives us where we're at now. Now, again, I want to remind everybody we're 300,000 years into our time as a species. Neanderthal, we're 600,000 years. Erectus were 2 million years. And Erectus were 1.7 million years before they grandchilded us, right? Before we came about, before their children created us, right? So these are not species that we have outlived. They're not species that we did better than. We might be doing worse than. None of these other species is responsible for their own mass extinction or any mass extinction. None of these other species is even really responsible for their die out, right? Uh, all that we see is really a narrowing of genetic diversity, which really has nothing to do with self responsibility. If you have traumas that happen and like an apocalyptic or an ice age or things like this events that narrow that genetic diversity, right? So no other species seems to have killed itself off, and we seem like we're trying to. Right? And we're only 300,000 years in, whereas they lived for 600,000 years or 2 million years, right? Some of these other species didn't live that long. To our understanding, Denisovian didn't live that long. To our understanding, currently the only finds that we have of Naladi stretch about 100,000 years. And Naladi was more brilliant than we are when we started, right? So some of them didn't live that long, but even those that did, but those that did live long lived way longer than we have, right? So when we're looking at the genetic diversity within ourselves, the understandings of fire and tool making and usage and clothing and the ability to cross water that we get from Homo erectus, we can see how we're really spreading across the globe and how we're really using those tools to spread across the globe, as well as how it's really just us and Homo erectus that does this, that has the ability to spread across the globe. All of the other species that come out of Homo erectus, not the subspecies, but the other species like Neanderthal, Naladi, Denisovian, Florensis, none of them were able to live in any other environment but the one that they speciated in. Neanderthal never makes it into Africa because Neanderthal cannot handle the hot. Period. Its DNA makes it into Africa at the time that it's mixing with sapiens, because sapiens are going back into Africa and carrying the genetics with them. But it itself never makes it down past the Levant area. And it only makes it to that upper Mediterranean Levant area when it's entering into the last ice age period that it is in. And it comes down into there earlier, absolutely, but it only comes down and meets up with us when it's entering into those last ice age spaces. And what you see is that in the interstitial, we start moving out and looking at cooler climates, and they start coming in. And they don't actually, again, make it past the Levant area, yet coming down into that area to escape the cold has that meetup happening. There was a recent article that I have to look through my history. I don't think I bookmarked it. That was talking about doubling down on what we've talked about Neanderthal and sapien living together for quite some time in the Levant area. Right, they're talking the Arabian Peninsula on this one, which means that there's other finds in the Arabian Peninsula. The Levant area is an open air find that I know of that is already on the website. Not all of the details of it, just one of the articles about it so that people can look deeper. But this newer article is just basically doubling down on the fact that we're moving up into the Arabian Peninsula, up into the Levant area, up until that area right outside of Africa, right? As temperatures start to get warmer. And we're doing that because we're moving into temperate zones. So they're zones that are safe for us to move into. They're also safe for Neanderthals to move into as their regions are getting colder, warmer, and then colder. And so in that last colder, as they're coming down, we're seeing the last of the Neanderthals. And we're seeing that that time period is when they're really mixing with us in that area. Now, this is where we're talking about how the out of Africa theory as a singular exodus has been debunked. But the idea that we all come from Africa and we've all left Africa in several waves is still understood. So when people talk to you about the out of Africa theory being debunked, what they're talking about is this belief that we're created in Africa whenever it was we were created from a singular unit in Africa, and then half of us leave Africa at 150,000, 200,000 years ago, really, really early on. And in isolation, we change. What they're trying to say is that we somewhat speciate. It's really that racist thought process, that race theory thought process that's trying to state that people in Eurasia are unique and different from people in Africa. And it's really that doubling down on that racism and that eugenics theory. Okay. So when they're talking about the out of Africa theory being debunked, what they're talking about is that the idea that we leave, half of us leave and become distinct from the half in Africa has been debunked. We now know that the idea that we ever separate and stop having sex with each other is ridiculous. We have never, ever stopped moving and our brains out. We've been doing it the whole time. When we weren't doing it with other Homo sapiens, we were doing it with Neanderthals and Denisovians and the five ghost species that we see in our DNA, right? Like we have constantly been moving, like it has been a constant go for us, right? We're just like that. We enjoy the gift that we have of being able to find pleasure in our bodies. And we enjoy finding that pleasure with unique things, right? And we are also very curious. So we always want to see what's over the next horizon. We are. I mean, that's really innately. So we've talked a few times about procreation being, an innate part of any species. And procreation is a unique part of any species. Of course, we differentiate in that from every other species because we have 5 life stages from neonate to adult. So we have currently 25 years from neonate to adult, newborn to adult. And in that time, we need more care than any other species does. No other species is longer than my belief is 5 years from neonate to being able to go independently, right? I mean, there's been a few different articles that have come across, but none of them have talked about the ones that we're talking about. Um, so I did see the article that talked about finding that genetic within Denisovian and Neanderthal. I think that's on the website. I'll see if I can find it if it's not. And that one talks about the fact that there are other ghost species that we've seen. I do think I saw an article recently that talked about a ghost species within the Oyo population. And I think I saw an article that talked about, so it talks about about AIs finding ghost species within European populations. I don't know enough about how the AIs are working or enough about what they are seeing that they're calling that for me to know whether or not that that's a truth or if it's something that it needs more study, right? So I haven't really looked at that. Like I've looked at it, but I haven't been like, oh, okay, well, let's talk about this yet because I don't trust AI enough to be honest. I guess like I trust AI on a lot of levels, but I don't know if it's really that like what is it finding, right? I don't know what is it finding and have we double down on it, right? So ghost species. Mhm. Ghost species are like so we have like a full DNA chain, right? We've all seen that picture of like that ladder. Ghost species are species where we see like a chunk in that chain, like 5 or 6 genomes or something like that within that chain. That is a unique species. We don't see that like DNA, like say that the DNA number is ABA and we are like C or AT and something like that, right? So we see something that is a completely unique signature, but we haven't found that unique signature in any fossil records or anywhere else. So we don't know what the full genomic is of it. But it is a unique signature in our DNA that we know isn't from Homo sapien DNA. And so we call it a ghost species because it's really just yeah, it's really just a fingerprint. I mean, I like it. There's a lot of cool things about that, but I don't trust it to understand everything because it's programmed by humans. That's really what it is that all computers are programmed by humans. That's how come we know that there's racism within computers. That's how we know that like those air dryers in a lot of bathrooms won't work for black people because of the fact that it doesn't register their skin color. How fucked up is that? And it's because it's programmed by white people, right? So we see a lot of that within any computer it's only as good as its programming, and even AI is only as good as what it's taught. So if, say, you're teaching AI total Western thought processes, you can't expect an AI to actually look at something and see an indigenous thought process. So when I look at AI, I don't think it's going to like kill us, but I also, but it's not the right word there. I don't think it's going to kill us. I do think that it is only as good as the people who are teaching it, and therefore it is going to miss a lot of information and not see a lot of information. There was an article that came across, and I haven't. This isn't one that I would probably do a talk on, but it was talking about there's these open loops on different tools or sticks, shafts that they have found in Europe, and most people are like, well, we don't know what it is. We think it's decoration. We think it's decoration. And somebody else took a look at it and goes, oh, well, that's for using an atlatl. It's a spear thrower. You use those loops to hook so that you can throw with, right? And so what we're looking at is the fact that somebody who had a broader understanding took a look at something that nobody could figure out and went, oh, I know what that is. I've seen that before. So AI doesn't have that broader understanding, right? It doesn't, we don't have indigenous people programming AI. We don't have, groups who are still living in a hunter-gatherer style of life programming AI. So because of those things, AI has a lot of bias in it, just like any other computer program currently has in it. And that's where I don't trust it to have an understanding of this scientific thought process specifically, because I think that um, because I don't like the way Western science Westerns, or sciences, I guess is the word there. I don't like the way it sciences because I see things that it doesn't, and I see its blindnesses. And AI is programmed by Western science, so I know that there are blind spots there, and that's where I'm like, yeah, no. Um, but there is something that I saw, but I don't know if that means that there is actually a ghost species that we actually have found within Western Europeans. But ghost species is something that we see a fingerprint of, but we don't find it in the fossil record yet. We see a couple of its genes in our genomics, and we know that they're unique and they're not Homo sapien, but we can't see them in the fossil record. This doesn't mean that we haven't found them. It means that we haven't gotten DNA that we can match. The only species that we have been able to get DNA from so far in the fossil record is Neanderthal and Denisovian outside of us. And the reason why with that is just the way ancient DNA works and just the way DNA decomposes. It decomposes less in hot or in cold, dry environments and fully submerged. But in hot environments or wet environments or a combination of hot and wet, it decomposes so much faster that by the time we get to it, we're not finding it. So it could be that we have found these species. We just don't have a genetic signature for these species or a genome for these species outside of what we see in our DNA. We do see, though, that there are between the species that we have found in the fossil record and the species that we see in our DNA, and the species, we have a ghost species that we see in Neanderthal and Denisovian DNA. And so the species that we see in the ghost species in Neanderthal and Denisovian DNA, that we're living with roughly 12 other species. Well, minimum 12 other species, possibly more, at the time of our lifespan. So from the start of our lifespan to now, we have lived with and either come in contact with the remains of or come in contact themselves with at least 12 other species, not counting the species that we descend from, like Heidelbergensis, rectus, or gaster, those species. So species that are descendants of those species, like we are cousin species, like there are cousins. We know that there are at least 12. When we're looking at that, when we're talking about how sapien themselves starts in Africa, it really doubles down on that knowledge that we have to start all together to be one species, because every other place that descendants of Homo erectus come from, they speciate into a different species. Every other space that Homo erectus goes, Homo erectus or its subspecies adapt to that area in isolation. And we have never isolated. Not only do we see that there is this genetic diversity in our creation, this lack of isolation in our creation itself, which is what these new articles are talking about. What this modification of our human species origin is talking about is the fact that instead of coming from a singular nation or a singular group of Homo heidelbergensis, it looks like we came from Heidelbergensis and Ergaster and Erectus and a all together, right? So even in our start, we have never isolated as a species. We have never been isolated. And this tells us that A, we've always been interacting and always been intermobile. B, we must all be the same species because the only way that we can breed and be as actively procreating as we are is if we're the singular species for one species. This does not mean that we can't have other species in us. Again, we currently know of seven other species that are within us between the five ghost species and Neanderthal and Denisovian. We currently know of seven other species that make up us. We currently know that every group of human on this planet has some other species within it. And so when we're looking at all of these things, it tells us A, the admixture is always present. We, again, like to move and we like to procreate. And B, that we're constantly in that movement. We are never, ever isolated, right? Absolutely. And that's another thing. These things really double down on most of the creation stories that we have, right? When we're looking at most creation stories talk about there being other people when they're created. I was talking to somebody from the Quiet People, the person that corrected me on how to pronounce. If you do not know, Khosin or Sian is a slur for the Quay people. There's a couple of clicks in that name when it's the correct name. So if you cannot pronounce with clicks, it's acceptable to say Quay, KWA or E, KW. I have it written KWA. It's correct to say KWA, Quay, but using the word that is the common pronunciation for them is considered to be a slur. It is something that they were named by the person who conquered them. Uh, when we are looking at this origin story that I was told by that group of people, or at least the person of that group of people, we're looking at a belief that as they're created, there's other groups out here, right? And so those other groups out here, if this is, and like I said, this was one of our oldest. We now see that Nama in this article, that the Nama people, and again, I do not know if the Nama are a subgroup of that. We now see that the Nama people have a great genetic diversity, or at least we're looking at the greatest genetic diversity currently. So when you're being created here, right? Knowing that there are Neanderthals over here and probably knowing that Naladi is over here. So as this creation story comes into play, it's talking about sapiens being created. And as sapiens are being created, there are other humans already on this planet that sapien comes in contact with as it leaves Africa, right? When we're looking at different stories across the globe, we look at the Turtle Island indigenous groups who talk about being created from the earth here. When we look at the Ceruti mastodon find, the Ceruti mastodon find shows us that Erectus makes it here and speciates before sapien makes it here. And if Erectus makes it here and speciates before sapien makes it here, and we have a ghost species in Turtle Island indigenous DNA, then the ghost species is who Erectus made it, who speciated from Erectus in Turtle Island. Speciation is being created in a space. Okay. So this is absolutely the idea of being created in a space, is that species that speciates from Homo erectus in Turtle Island. And when sapien comes here and envelops that group within them and takes that DNA and takes that family lineage and takes the ancestry in with them. And takes is probably not the best word, but I mean it as in that enveloping sense, that communal sense, right? When we envelop that within, then we are embodying being created here, right? Same thing in the biblical story. Even the Bible talks about other gods at the creation point and other human beings at the creation point. It talks about the sons of Adam marrying different women out there, right? So there are other humans out there, even within the Bible. So when we're looking at the biological, the scientific knowledge here, we absolutely see that all the creation stories so far that I have heard, you can see the correlation in the scientific evidence today, right? When we're looking at the way that we're moving out, right, there is validity to the idea, there is validity to the knowledge that moving out of Africa, it comes in waves, successive waves. So we have a lot of knowledge that when we talk about the 50,000 years ago as the last common ancestor of everybody currently outside of Africa, except for Australia, indigenous people currently, what we're talking about is the fact that at 150,000 years ago, when we're moving into the Levant area, there are some people that are going up a little bit further north. There are some people that are going a little bit further east, not so much west. We don't see a lot of west until much later, but we do find peoples going up or into the Arabian Peninsula. We do find these people kind of spreading out, again, still all within that Levant or close Levant area. These are all Homo sapiens. Their genetics didn't survive. Their DNA isn't currently within us. So when we're talking about at that last point of 50,000 years ago being the common ancestor of everybody outside of Australia, outside of Africa, what we're talking about is that 50,000 years ago, the ancestors, the genetic start of all the people that are outside of Africa are linked to that group leaving. Now, when we look at things like mitochondrial DNA or Y-DNA, which is really what we're talking about the Adams and the Eves of DNA. So, like when we talk about a mitochondrial Eve, what we're talking about is the founder of a mitochondrial DNA line. And when we look at DNA, we have a tendency to be able to trace it to where it starts and where it stops. So, Africa is all L. Right outside of Africa is M. And then you get N, and then you get O. And as you go further, it changes. With the exception of X, it all traces down through the alphabet. You end up, I think it traces back in the Y DNA. Like it goes, I think that there's like an A in the Y DNA differently that's kind of throws me off sometimes. And DNA is not my specialty. But we can trace the mitochondrial Eves back to the origin of that mitochondrial DNA. When we look at the mitochondrial DNA X1, it's unique to Turtle Island. X2 in Siberia is a backwards, it's a daughter of X1. So when you have R1 or X1 or L1, what you're looking at is the first. Okay. And then say, well, and you do like in Africa, you have L1, L2, right? Like, so L1 would be, and I think maybe L0 in Africa. So L1 would be before L2, right? So when we're looking at that, we alphabetize it and we also numericalize it. And this is why DNA and me don't get along because it doesn't make a syllabic sound. So when we're looking at that, we can trace those migration patterns out. And at 50,000 years ago, the descendants are the ancestors of everybody who is currently outside, except for Indigenous Australians, leaves the Levant area and expands. Now, this does not mean that they did not leave sometimes with people whose genetics don't exist today. And it does not mean that there weren't people who had left, though not very far out, because we don't find any skeletons or any evidence further out. But we do have people that left. They just thank you. They just didn't stay, like their genetics didn't stay. They're not passing down those genetics. Their family line died out. So we know that we all start in Africa. We know that we leave and we come back, and we leave and we come back, and we leave and we come back, and we leave and we come back. This is again how Neanderthal DNA gets in Africa prior to colonization. And then we know that at some point, and my understanding, and it's not like the, yeah, it probably is. Okay, so the ending of the last ice age would have hit that area roughly 50,000 years ago. So I believe that when I'm trying to picture the glacial maximum in my mind, that along the Mediterranean basin, and so there's a line that starts slightly above the Mediterranean, like leaves on a map in my mind, roughly like that much. So maybe like 100 miles from the northern part of the Mediterranean basin over, which means that in Western Eurasia or East Western Eurasia, that you've got maybe 100 miles of land that's areable, that is, and not like you're gardening yourself, but like tendable, gatherable, right? We know that like the last Neanderthals that we find are in Gibraltar at 30,000 years ago, right? So we know that you can make it across the lower part of Eastern Eurasia much earlier because of the fact that Eastern Eurasia has more land space instead of sea space that's open underneath that glacial maximum. So as that glacial maximum goes up, people are going this way and then up over, right? Because at first, that 100 miles roughly, it doesn't like there's the Strait of Gibraltar, but there's another strait over here that goes up to where Byzantium used to live. Excuse me, my maps in my mind are way older than the maps we currently have. Countries are all older than the countries we currently have. So we couldn't make it across the top to get across that water glacial meet to get to this side of the Mediterranean, right? Or above the Mediterranean. So we're going this way until the ice retreats enough for us to make it across the top and make it into Western Europe. We know that we start to see that exodus out of Africa at 50,000 years ago. I think our current knowledge puts, like, there was an article that came out just a couple of days ago that's talking about 52 to 42,000 years ago of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens living in the same area in Eurasia. I believe, I'd have to double down on the article, but I believe it's not Western Eurasia. It might be on the Iberian Peninsula, but I cannot remember exactly where the locale is on that one. But when we're looking at that again, what we're looking at is that ice starts to recede, we start to move up in. And that last out, that last we're all going is at 50,000 years ago. And that again is because we have hit an interstitial period. These interstitial periods, the times in between glacial maximums, are when Eurasia is at its most livable. We can go into it, right? If it's a glacial maximum, most of North America and Eurasia is under ice and we can't really function on it. So we have to go to regions that are not under ice. So as we understand the exodus out of Africa, the maybe I don't like exodus because exodus kind of implies something differently. So as we look at the last migration out of Africa, what we're looking at is a last migration. We're not looking at the only migration out of Africa. And that's what they're talking about when they're talking about out of Africa debunked. Again, the old theory of out of Africa stated that about 100,000, 150,000 years ago, Homo sapien leaves Africa and it never goes back. And it really is to kind of double down on that racist thought process. It's really to kind of double down on that eugenics thought process and kind of state that Europeans are somehow unique in the way that they have almost speciated. This really gives that race, right? It really gives that, well, we've been in this area, so we've adapted to this area, so we're different in this way. When we know that there's never a one way, A, and B, it's never single. It doesn't just stay. It's a constant move. And it is that constant movement that constant interaction, that constant admixture, that constant interbreeding, that constant exchange of knowledge that is us as a species that gives us advancement. We think that we all got somewhere and stayed because we're taught that we all got somewhere and stayed. Because for a point of time where they create nation states, nations, countries, and they decide that they need to hold you here, we did stay. But that's been the only time in our existence where we weren't migrating, where we weren't constantly moving. And again, this is about control of a government. This is about making sure that they maintain control over the things that you do, about making sure that they get the most exploitable resource out of you, right? So if they can exploit, if they can keep you here, then they can exploit you here, whether it's exploit your farming technology, whether it's exploit your body in war, whether it's exploit your body in other ways. The more that they can maintain this lock on you, these borders, and this idea that you're not allowed to move, and we don't move. Why would you think we move? We just come someplace and we just stay there. The more that they can double down on that thought process, the more they can control, right? So the idea that we have ever stayed in one place when it wasn't controlled by an outsider within the last couple of thousand years, really, even because we're not even looking at seeing that within the Greeks, we're not seeing that within the Assyrians, we're not seeing that within the Germanic people, we're not seeing that within the Celtic people. Nobody ever stays in one place until we get to really modern Europe. Really the idea that you need a passport to cross a border, you know, really the idea that you need to be documented as having come from a space. Um, we really don't even see it like in early, like even in the early church, you see a lot of movement and migration. You see a lot of people who are, like somebody who does stonework is going to travel around many different kingdoms to complete their stonework, right? So even in the early, Roman control of the Roman Catholic Church, right? Even then, even up until like 14, 15, 1600s, we see a lot of migration. We see a lot of movement. Um, we don't see a lot of, and even in the time periods where we think of ourselves as being only in one space, we still see a lot of people who are either migrating, immigrating, or traveling for work, like merchanting, right? So even in the times where we think of ourselves as being, born and dying in one space, there are still many, many other people out there that are constantly moving. It is not human to stay in one space, right? Um, I've talked before about, if you've got 300 generations or 100 generations living in a cave, it's much more safe and stable than today's economy where they can kick you out of your house. And I believe that this is true. I believe that we have spaces that we will create a home and have many generations in that. I also believe that in that time, we're still traveling around and mingling. We're still interwoven, right? So, say that you belong to the first one that springs to mind is say that you belong to a indigenous group in the Pacific Northwest, and you'll see why I'm using this one in a second. When we talk about hunter gatherers, we tend to think that hunter gatherers are all like nomadic constantly and like they don't have actual homes. Many spaces that are hunter gatherer styles of society in the Pacific Northwest actually have a wooden home in 3 or 4 different locations, and they'll move between their summer home and their winter home depending on what they're going to find there. Hunter gatherer really just means having a territory that you move within to follow the seasons, as opposed to collectors who have a singular spot and they move out to collect and bring back, out to collect and bring back. So this is hunter gatherer versus collector, and this is animism. This is who we all were before the city state invention of Western agriculture kind of shit goes on, right? So even in spaces where you have a hunter gatherer group that is constantly on the move, you're going to have a home here and a home here and a home here. And in those spaces where you have a home here and a home here and a home here, you're migrating or moving between those homes, depending on the seasons, depending on, the food that you can find. And that's really what it is, depending on the food that you can find during the seasons. But you might still have a wooden home within those that is built, that is staying there the entire time when you're not there, and you come home and you kind of set it up and you make sure and brush out all the cobwebs, and make sure that the wood's all repaired and your roof is good every year when you come in. Even in groups that are groups that are migrating within a specific space like that, you're going to see that in those migration routes, they're going to overlap with other groups. So if again, I'm going to go with the Pacific Northwest. It's just easy. If I have a home up in the San Juan Islands, and I have a home over on the western side of the Cascades, say in Ellensburg style way, and then I have a home in Portland, right? As I'm migrating, say I belong to Group A. I'm not going to use any specific Indigenous nations names. Say I belong to Group A, and if you don't know the Pacific Northwest geography, San Juan Islands is on the coast. You cross the Cascade Mountains to get to Ellensburg, and then Portland, North Oregon, you have to go down. It's about 4 hours south by car from the San Juans to get to Portland. You have to cross the river, right? So say that, and maybe they don't cross the river, maybe they stay on the other side. And maybe what it is we know that whaling season works really well up here, and berries and deer are really good over here during the summer and the fall. Whaling, you're going to maybe say winter, right? And down here, you get the salmon runs, right? So as you're migrating through and you're going from here across the mountains to over here, and then you're coming down to here, Group B has their regions also in Ellensburg, right? And then they also come down to the Columbia, but they go down to the Columbia on the west side or east side. And then they go over to Idaho, right? So, well, Group A is going to this point for the berries and the deer. Group B is going to this point for the berries and the deer, and maybe they're a mile apart. So they're interacting and they're interchanging, and they're maybe finding family, and they're maybe finding mates, and they're maybe learning new things. So even when you have migratory patterns of peoples who are different migratory patterns, you're going to see that there's going to be an interconnect. Say you have a collector group. Again, a collector group is where you have a central location, and you go out and you get berries here in the spring, and you go out and you get a deer here in the fall, and you go out and you get the salmon run over here, right? So say that you have a collector group, right? This collector group is probably going to share this berry patch with somebody that's a collector group over here, or even a migratory hunter-gatherer group that comes in and they get some berries, and the collector group gets some berries, and they mingle and they meet and they go, and then they both go back to their respective places and maybe take a couple partners back with them, right? Or maybe don't even take partners, just leave some genetic going, and that genetic gets cared for by this group. So this is where you see that even in a space of time where we're doing a movement constantly, you're going to get that intermix, right? You're going to get that you might have a stable home for 100 generations in this wooden lodge that you have, that every year you do repairs when you come into town, and so you have a stable home for 100 generations, just like you might in a cave, but you also have that constant movement and mix. Now say you're in a cave for 100 generations. If we look at, again, I mean, Jean M. All was accurate for her time. When you look at the way that Jean M. All wrote in Clan of the Cave Bear, of them gathering and meeting every 5 years, right? So you're seeing that you're getting that genetic intermix then, right? You're also going to see, even if you are, we talked a while ago about the group in the Philippines, where, or not in the Philippines, the group in Borneo, where there was the full foot amputation that was successful, right? And the fact that this means that this is probably something that's been practiced over a couple of generations, because you don't do a successful near fucking absolutely perfect, like better than any we've seen today, right? Full foot amputation without like the first time out the gate. You're not going to get it perfect the first time out the gate. You're going to kill a couple people, right? So we know that this is something that's probably a couple of generations, and we know that this is something that somebody has to teach somebody, right? Well, most of the times, if you have a group of 30 people, it's not very likely that you have a surgeon in your group. Not every group has a surgeon, right? Not everybody has, if it's only 30 people, not everybody has somebody who's really prone to medical knowledge. So you might have somebody who's a traveling surgeon, right? Or maybe you have somebody who's a surgeon who taught your surgeon, right? Maybe you have two surgeons in two different groups and you have 10 groups, right? So as you're looking through that, what you're looking at is that there's still, even if we're living in this cave for 100 generations, we're still going to another group to get information. We're still going to another group to get genetics. We're still going to another group to mix and to mingle, right? So we have never, ever, ever, ever isolated. And not only have we never, ever isolated in any like archaeological standpoint, in any like logical standpoint, we've also never isolated in our genetics, our DNA. We look at the DNA of humans today and we see that DNA. So I can tell you that your ancestors might have lived in a space for 300 generations, like the guy who's a direct descendant of Chatterman in England, who's a hundred or a mile from where Chatterman was found, right? Direct descendants there. So he's been there for literally 300 generations. His family has been there for literally 300 generations. But even looking at that, we see that people in the seventh century, not seventh century, in 700, 733 CE, I believe, is the grave that I know of, where we see this little girl who's buried beside her two aunts, and her maternal DNA and her aunt's maternal DNA, or her aunt's DNA is all the same DNA of as Cheddarman, that same Western European. It's like EW3 or something like that. It's like a specific lineage, right? Or East Western European hunter gatherer or something weird. So we see that a huge percentage of her DNA and her aunt's DNA is that, but we also see that she's 33% West African, right? So even here in 700, and even if they're the same mitochondrial group as Cheddarman on that Western European DNA, WE, whatever it is, DNA, and she has a vast majority of that DNA from this space in Britain that's been here for fucking ever and has descendants there still. She still has that 33% East African DNA that shows that she had somebody from East Africa, and it's a father lineage from East Africa coming up and trading or migrating or moving, right? So even when we're looking at a group where you can trace the mitochondrial or the Y DNA back to this place for 7,000 years, there are still other DNAs in that group that have come from outside that specific space and contributed their DNA to that group. Just like when we look at things like the Bell Beakers, we can see that, well, the DNA isn't shared among the Bell Beakers. They don't have similar DNAs. They're not the same genetic lineage. The culture is shared. And this shows migration of people. This shows that, well, DNA A is, DNA B is, and DNA C is, and here A, B, and C are still talking to each other and sharing each other's ideas, sharing each other's culture. So again, when we talk about how we're coming about as a species, which is what this article is talking about, we're talking about having a species that comes about of the constant intermixing of the subspecies of Homo erectus and then the early creations of the subspecies of Homo erectus. So they're talking about it kind of becoming more distinguished as a singular group at like 120 to 135,000 years ago in this specific article, which what this would say is that we know that in the same space that Homo sapien has already been there for roughly 160,000 years. Yeah, we'll say roughly 160 because it's 135 for the end of it, right? So roughly for 160,000 years. So the start of Homo sapien at that point is several different unique groups that are intermixing to create Homo sapien, and then Homo sapien itself starts as several different unique groups that are constantly interbreeding to create the current that we have, right? And again, we get this constant mix, constant admixture, constant fun, right? We're constantly having fun with each other. And when we're looking at the out of Africa has been debunked. What we're looking at is the fact that a singular exodus from Africa, a singular movement out, and everybody outside of Africa is the result of this singular movement out, and that's all it is, right? At 150,000 years ago. Uh, it's just not true. Out of Africa is still there. We still know that we started in Africa and that we left Africa. We just now know that it was many times and back in, many times and back in. Thank you so much. Many times and back in. Come out, come back, come out, come back. Let's take some Neanderthal DNA down with us. Ooh, I met these really cool people. Want to tell you about them. Let me show you this new tool. Did you see this new clothing item that I have? Man, I've been painting my face lately. Have you? Right? We have this constant flow because that is who we are as a people. We as a species must have that constant community. Again, we know that we are innately nurturing and communal and curious. We know that we are innately communal because we have to have uh, midwife assisted childbirth. The way our children are born, the shape of the skull, the shape of the pelvic outlet, we have to have assistance. The child turns in the pelvic passage, and there has to be a turning of that child. We do know there are exceptions. Somebody with an extremely small child, somebody and a big pelvis, or somebody who is extremely flexible and may be able to move down there and turn it on their own. I mean, I can reach places most people can't. So there are those exceptions to those rules, but as a standard, we have midwife assist childbirth mandatory, which means that we must have somebody help us give birth. We must have somebody help us pull that baby out. And when we look at the fact that we are 5 life stages from neonate firstborn to fully formed adult, currently 25 years, when we look at that fact, we look at the fact that no other species has that extended amount of need of care of an infant. We're it. Neanderthal only had 4. They're the only other species that's had mandatory midwifed childbirth. Okay. So Neanderthal also had to have community and also had to have nurturing. That nurturing comes in that 5 life stages from neonate to adult. You have to have many people gather together to ensure a singular child makes it to adulthood. You cannot expect 1 or 2 people to take a singular child from neonate to adulthood in a space and in a time where it takes 5 people to go hunting and 5 people to go gathering, and somebody still has to stay at home and keep the fire alive and make sure that that baby doesn't fall, right? So you have to have multiple peoples. Therefore, we are communal, and we are all nurturing because it takes the nurture of every single one of us. Now, we all nurture in different ways. And some people, due to genetics or due to harm, trauma, are not nurturing at all. And we've all met women who aren't nurturing at all. So to assume that all women are nurturing is kind of weird. Um, so we see that we are absolutely nurturing and we're absolutely communal. We also see that in things like Denisova Cave that we're seeing Homo sapiens and Homo Neanderthal and Homo Denisovians living together in bands. Band, again, is a group that has no genetic relation, where tribe is a group that is all genetically related. So we see 3 different species of Homo living in one space and intermixing in that space. We are always and have always been communal, and we are always and have always been curious. This curiosity is science. This curiosity is technology. And we see that these things go back to Homo erectus, right? Homo erectus is our first scientist, really. It's our first to adapt the adaptation, to take the tool that they get from Paranthropus boisei and adapt that tool into something that's new that can be used better, the Acheulean hand axe assemblage, right? So when you see that, what you're seeing is that science. When you're looking at the fact that Erectus is who gives us the control of fire, you're looking at, oh yeah, that's sad. I'm so sorry, Jen. And that happens. I know that happens. Um, I have a parent who had a lot of trauma early in life, and it doesn't nurture well. So yeah, I can totally see where that happens. I have researched some of RH, but not too deep. there are a couple of factors I will go over with Rh factor, but give me just a second. So when we're looking at that, we're absolutely seeing that there is this constant movement, this constant community, and out of Africa means we go out and we come back in. We go out, we come back in. We go out and we come back in. They do know now that, with the exception of an indigenous Australians whose mitochondrial and Y DNA they can trace back 70,000 years. And that's how they know indigenous Australians have been in Australia for 70,000 years, is because of the way they trace their DNA back. Okay. With the exception of those, everybody else's DNA traces back to mitochondrial Adam and Eve that leave the Levant area 50,000 years ago. And with that tracing back of that DNA, we're absolutely seeing that it gives us that last common ancestor leaving the Levant area roughly 50,000 years ago and spreading out. Now, again, we do have some newer evidence that came across within the last week that talks about 52 to 42,000 years ago. I can't remember which spot in Eurasia that's actually at, so I can't give any more information on it. I'll make sure that I get a little bit more information from the article and dig in a little bit deeper so I can give some more information if it pushes back the timeline of us actually being out of the Levant area. Rh factor. So how we type blood is based on the antigens around the blood, not on the cell itself. So you have your blood cell, and then around it is a bunch of antigens that kind of free float, or not free float, but like stick to it and kind of float around it or work on the surface of it. A, B, and O are a set of antigens on that surface. And when they tell you that you're A, what they're telling you is that the antigen A for that specific ABO antigen series is what's on your blood. When they're telling you, so when we look at Rh, the Rh antigens on the surface of the blood, there's 49 of them. And Rh capital D is the one that if a mother doesn't have it and a child does, after the first pregnancy with a child that does, her body's antigens start building up antigens against it because it's not present in her. When we look at RHD, if you have it in your body, you are Rh positive. And if you don't have RHD in your body, you are Rh negative. Now, again, that's capital D because there's a small d, and we all have small d. We all have all the rest of the antigens for Rh factor, or the Rh antigens. And it's Rh and then another letter, right? And these, again, are antigens on the surface of the blood cell, okay? So when we look at those who do not have Rh capital D, we see that there are many populations around the globe. And I had an article on it that actually gave me the highest percentages, but I haven't looked at it in a couple of months. So I could not give you what they were, but I do know that there's like 3 different spaces where it's 19% of the population is Rh negative. None of them are the Basque. Everybody wants to say it's the Basque, and it's not. But there are 3 different spaces that are like 19% Rh negative. Every population, primary population, has a percentage of Rh negative people. And all Rh negative, again, is the missing of RHD. And when you miss RHD and you have a child and you get pregnant with a child that carries RHD, your body builds up an immunity to the RHD. And so the next child you carry that carries the RHD genetics, or the RHD antigen in their blood, is something that your body attacks. And so your body will treat it as if it was a virus, basically, because again, it's an antigen, right? And this antigen, when it's seeing it, like, so if I have all the other if I have all the other Rh antigens, I know what the Rh antigens look like. I just don't have RHD. And so when my body sees RHD antigen in the first baby, and the first baby's blood goes into mine and my blood goes back, because that's what the umbilical cord and the placenta does, like it translates that blood through. When that happens, my body for the first time sees RHD, and instead of treating RHD like, oh, welcome home, it goes, who the fuck are you? And it starts building up barriers. And so the next child I have that has RHD antigens, it will say, oh, I saw you before and I didn't like you, right? And it will kill that child, unless you take medicine to stop that. So It's not really it it's not even really something that you can trace, like, it's not even a family line thing. It's definitely not a population thing. It is definitely not the aliens. Um, because I don't think that you think any of those. I'm just stating all of those because a lot of people do, and so I wanna make sure. But it is none of those things, and it's not a different species. I've had people tell me it means it's a different species, and it's not a different species either. It's the same species. It's just lacking an antigen in the body and the presence of an antigen, and then deciding that that antigen is a virus, right? Because we know that antigens really just build up the fight for our body. Antigens create antibodies to ensure that we don't get sick, right? And so that's all it is. This is an antigen that isn't there. So when the other parts of that antigen see it, they go, "What the fuck are you?" So that's RH factor. Um, I've kind of covered a lot of things, and I don't know who comes in when. So if there are any questions over anything on the background or anything I've said, I'm going to go ahead and open it up so people can ask. And then I'll probably um, take off shortly. I'm going to try and be back in tonight, but it'll probably be later this evening, like after 8 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. And again, this live has been dual streamed on YouTube. I don't usually face the YouTube camera as much, so you're not going to see me facing you as much on YouTube as you do on TikTok. But if you want to watch it and see anything you missed, it is absolutely on the YouTube. Hello, hello. So if there are any questions about what it means when people say out of Africa has been debunked, which does not mean that we did not come from Africa, but means that a singular time out of Africa is not what happened. Or the newer articles that talk about the way that we originate as a species, or just anything else, please go ahead and ask, and I'll do my best to answer. And I'll look over at or at YouTube too if you want to ask over there. I do know that a lot of times I don't, but I do have the computer up right now. So if you are asking, or if you are, I do see that there is somebody over there. If you would like to ask any questions, if there's anything that you are looking to understand, I will make sure I get to it. Thank you, thank you. I need to do a video. I need to go and find all of the Facebook accounts that I got my earrings from, so that I can give people connections. This was a request, and I believe it was Jessica Combs who did this one, but I'm not exactly sure. It's been like 2 years, and these are the only stuff that I have from her specifically. But I had requested turtles with abalone because I have a love of sea things, and I'm a turtle person. Um, but I love my earrings. I have lots of really cool earrings. I'm going to let you finish that question, Santi, so that I can make sure I understand what the question is. But definitely think I understand. I think I know, but I want to let you finish it. And yes, I think the answer is yes, but I'll have to double check. And I also want to know, what do you mean by, yep, okay, and what do you mean by public? Uh, or do you mean Pueblo? Because I see that you're Pueblo. Do you mean the Pueblo people? Um, or do you mean the Pueblo and the people? We do see that the Pueblo have advanced trading routes all around. We also see that the Mayan have advanced trading routes. We also see that the, uh, not the Aztec, I'm not sure if the Aztecs are actual trading routes. I think that they might be different kinds of routes. We see that the Mississippian complex, really, we see that Turtle Island is just a vast mix of, not mix of peoples like cultures, but a vast mix of migration and trade and everything else. We do know that, we can trace language patterns back a certain way by seeing root words in different languages. Like my name, Widda, comes from uh, the root word, or the ancient word for the word witch in Celtic language. Wid meaning knowledge, which we see in Druid, and da meaning feminine. So it means knowledge of the feminine, and it's the female half of the Druidic class, right? So we do know that you can trace that from Britain all the way to India, right? Like that language goes all the way. And so we know by that that we have what we call Proto-Indo-European, which is the ancient language really that most of Western Europe gets its languages from if we trace them back. We know that the same thing happens in the Turtle Islands. So we know that the Dene language goes from the bottom of Mexico all the way up into the Great Plains, and that it starts at the top of California with an expanse between the Great Plains, like of the mountains, of the mountain range, the Cascades, from the top of California all the way up into Canada, I think up into Alaska, but I can't remember for certain if it's up into Alaska. But we do see that like the Dene language really covers a broad expanse. There's a few, and then of course that doesn't mean that everybody there speaks Dene language now. What it means is that the base language, the ancient language that roots all the other language, comes from the Dene, or is a Dene language group, right? It doesn't mean that everybody speaks Dene. It doesn't mean that modern Dene is the direct correlation to the ancient Dene. It just means that that language group goes all the way through here. This is an example of heavy migration patterns. We do know things like we see stone that has been napped that comes from mountains clear across the country, right? So, and then we do see, like in South America, we see that there's a lot of trade routes that are like I think we've known for quite a while, like the highways of the gods and stuff, and like the Andes and stuff, where we believe that so I don't do a lot of like real in-depth study of location and peoples in the Turtle Islands. So I'm really cautious and I'm hoping that I'm not misnaming. I believe it's the Inca in the Andes, right? And I believe that there's like trade routes that we can see that the Inca took, and that the Inca take these trade routes all across the Andes Mountains and down into the different jungle areas down there, right? So we do see through and those come from just beaten ground, right? Like we can see the actual paths still, right? So through things like the paths that we can see, through things like languages, and through things like finding a flint napped knife in Mexico, but the flint comes from the Cascade Mountains, tells us that there is a constant movement here as well, right? Um, Again, we're definitely migrating out of Africa when everybody, like as everybody else is migrating out or coming back in and migrating out. And then we have that final migration out after, 50,000 years ago. And then we see that Turtle Island indigenous people have like 0. Or 0.02 or 0.03 percent Denisovian DNA, which shows the likelihood of a southern boat route, actually. But we know that we mix with the Denisovians for roughly 2,000 or 10,000 years because of that percentage of that DNA. And so when we're looking at that, that tells us that we have like 10,000 years that we're mixing with the Denisovians. And then we're coming over here. Maybe we brought some Denisovians with us. We also see that there is a ghost species within Turtle Island indigenous species, or Turtle Island indigenous groups. And that ghost species is going to be just like Neanderthal and Denisovian are species that speciate from Erectus. The Cerruti mastodon find in San Diego shows us that Erectus made it here and speciated here. So when we get here, and our current oldest evidence of sapien in Turtle Island is 33,000 years ago in a cave in the southern tip of Mexico. So believing that we get here around 33,000 years ago, again, the current oldest evidence, it might be pushed back as time goes on. But the current oldest evidence being that we see that when sapiens getting here, they're enfolding the species that is here that Homo erectus speciated into here, because that's the ghost species we see in our DNA. And so we're enveloping them within us as we get here. So even from the very beginning and how we get here, we're a very migratory species, and we're a very again, we're so curious. Really the reason we leave Africa to start with, the reason Homo erectus leaves Africa to start with, the reason we've ever moved and ever migrated is curiosity. What's over the horizon? What's the next thing, right? And so we see that translates here into the Turtle Islands, just like it's everywhere else. It's how we got here, right? Nobody jumps on a boat and crosses the islands of the South Pacific because they're, bored or, because they're, not curious. Oh, I really like home, but let me jump on these boats, right? Like, nobody does that because they're really happy staying right where they're at. We have this insatiable curiosity and this insatiable creativity. And so we definitely see that as we come over here, that we're definitely continuing this movement pattern, right? And we even see this like we know that Polynesian DNA, which we have decided currently that I think it's the Maori people are like the newest indigenous people at like 2,500 years. And they've decided that based on how the islands are, how old the islands that they find Maori people on, not, anything else, which to me is problematic because those islands come and go in the South Pacific all the time. Islands pop up, islands disappear. I mean, not like all the time, but very frequently. I mean, they just found a whole fucking continent that they thought was not there. And it's because we've been talking about this continent that's there. And because of the water rising, it's smaller now than what it was before. So, um, when we're looking at that, we're seeing that uh, they found Polynesian DNA in pre-contact Brazilians. So this tells us of this migration. And so Polynesian DNA in Brazilians would be DNA that starts in the Polynesian area after people get to Brazil, right? Because of the fact that we know that people, and we know that not everybody in Turtle Island is 33,000 years ago, right? Like we know that there's successive waves of migration and there are migration waves back as well. This is where we get X1 here and X2 in Siberia. So this would tell us that we see the Polynesians migrating as well and us coming maybe even back, or maybe somebody over in Brazil starts over on the west coast and meets up with somebody from Polynesia and they intermix and then that DNA goes over here, right? But this is another example of this constant flow. And this constant flow is both in North and South America, but it's also back and forth, right? We think of the globe that we see in the classroom, but if you look at a globular picture from the top of an accurate picture, what you see is that there's a bunch of islands along the top of the art, or the top of our continents, Turtle Island, North America, and the Eurasian continent. There's a bunch of islands of ice, and then there's the pole, right? But on the edge of the pole, there's all these islands. We've been an island hopping people since Erectus, and we've been an Arctic people well, since Neanderthal, really, right? Neanderthals were very Arctic sensitive, right? So we've been an Arctic people for a long time, and you absolutely see that we can see that migration back of the X1 DNA to Siberia, and these are both spaces that are right up along the northern edges of their continents that have that island hopping ability, that are already Arctic people and understand how to move and how to work within the Arctic, right? So that backwards flow and the flow kind of really, and that's not even the Kelp Highway. So the Kelp Highway is a northern route in in the Pacific, where they believe, the edge of Asia up over the Bering Strait and down, right? And then of course we have the Southern Pacific boat route that's currently being investigated, that I've been trying to, like, I'm like, I know there's proof for this bitch out there for the last 10 years. Like, I'm like, I know we came to, and I knew that because actually, if you look at many indigenous stories along the Western coast, they're boat stories. They talk about coming here in boats. And then you saw the Polynesian DNA come up, and then we know the Denisovian DNA come up, and the Denisovians are really only in South East Eurasia, right? And down in the islands of the Pacific and down in Australia, right? So if Denisovian DNA is really only there, then it makes more sense for the southern boat route. And it is actually why they're just looking at a southern boat route right now. But we do now know that there's at least 3 waves that are coming into the Americas, right? And we do now know that within the Americas, there is this constant movement, north, south, east, west, right? That does not mean that there are not specific genetic lineages, That does not mean that there are not very concrete, distinct ethnicities, because there are very concrete, distinct ethnicities here in the Turtle Islands, and there are very concrete, distinct lineages here in the Turtle Islands, and those things need to be honored, right? X1 starts here, right? How does X1 start here? I wonder sometimes, is that in that ghost lineage, right? Like, is that ghost species where we get that X1 and then take it back to Siberia, but we don't see a ghost species in Siberia, right? So, there's this constant, and that's just humanity again. Like, we really like to think that we get somewhere and we stay. And we've only done that because other people are controlling us. We've only done that because if I'm here, I'm easier for you to exploit. And if I leave, you can't exploit me anymore. Somebody else gets to exploit me. So if a narcissistic God king, or, the what comes after, decides that the more people I have, the more exploitation I get out of the deal, and I don't want that king to exploit what I get to exploit, then you get nationalism. You get stay here and you don't move, right? Because movement becomes irregular, or it becomes outlawed, or you have to have a special license, or you have to have a passport, or you have to have things like that to move. Until we get to that point, until we get to a point where somebody is controlling our movement, we don't have a lot of it's not that we don't have stability, because I believe we have more stability than we do now, right? It's that we don't have a lot of isolation, right? Um, and again, as I was talking earlier, if we're looking at like the difference between hunter gatherer and the difference between collector, I want to explain those first. Hunter gatherers are an animistic group that follows seasonal patterns. And that animistic group following seasonal patterns collects along those patterns, but they go to the same space usually every year. They might actually have a singular. Here in the Pacific Northwest, there are groups that actually have wooden lodges, cedar lodges that they return to every year. This is your winter lodge, this is your summer lodge, this is your fall lodge, right? And so they're moving to those different spaces every year and gathering the resources and living in those spaces while the resources are there. And then they'll move to the space that has different resources, right? Whereas a collector group stays in one space and goes out and collects resources during different times. Now, both of these groups have plenty of way of intermingling. If you look at a hunter-gatherer group, and I'm going to use this Pacific Northwest as an example, who does maybe their springs in the Pacific, in the Puget Sound, and does their summers in Ellensburg, and does their falls along the Columbia, say in Portland, right? Um, San Juan's is in the west, or Puget Sound is on the west coast. It's on the edge, like it's up against the sea, basically. And Ellensburg is right inside on the other side of the Cascade Mountains from the San Juans, or from Puget Sound. They're kind of the same thing, but kind of not. Um, I grew up in the San Juans, so it's the San Juans that comes to mind. And then Portland's down here, right? But we'll call it Vancouver, above the Columbia, so they're not having to cross the Columbia. So if I do my winter or my spring here in the Puget Sound, and I do my summer here in Ellensburg, and there's another group that does their winter up in, say, say their winter is down along the Columbia, and their summer is in Ellensburg, and their fall is over Kettle Falls. And their fall is over in Kettle Falls because there's a great salmon run in Kettle Falls, right? So, and we have evidence of it, right? So when we summer from group A, summering in Ellensburg to get the deer, group B is also summering in Ellensburg to get the deer. We're there at the same time. We might be creating two different villages or campsites or communities who are even intermixed. Like sometimes they're even like, well, this is our summer camp and we all camp along this river, and we all camp in this valley, and like you might have like the camp where they're butt up against each other, but this leader is here and this leader is here, and then there are people around them, right? But you're still getting that mix in the summer. And so in the summer, you're trading ideas, you're trading genetics. If you are a collector group, and say, we're going to go back to the Paleolithic with this. Say you're a collector group, and your collector group lives in Cave A. and collector group over here lives in cave B. But every summer, you both go to hunt deer in the same space, right? Because again, collector group stays in one place, but they'll go get their strawberries here at this time of year, which I think is like late spring, early summer. I'm off on my seasonal time adjustments on migrations and stuff. And then, but their deer, their hunting for their deer is going to be in their fall, right? And so they're both hunting in this specific valley. Now, this collector group lives, over here in this mountain range, and this collector group lives over here in this mountain range, and they've both lived in these caves for 300 generations. This is a very stable home for both of them, okay? But every summer, they both go to this valley in the center, and that's where they hunt their deer. They're going to be meeting up. They're going to be exchanging ideas. They're going to be exchanging genetics, and they're still living in a space that they have lived for several generations. We know with the two caves in the Levant area where Neanderthals live in one cave and we live in the other cave, and they're 5-minute walk from each other, that we lived there for 100,000 years. They lived there and we lived there for 100,000 years. And so we have these two caves. This is where we believe the most genetic exchange between us and Neanderthal actually happens. And we're both in these caves for 100 years, right? That's at least 4 or 5 generations, right? Every generation currently is 25 years. They're going to be less prior, because a generation is neonate to fully formed brain when you look at generations with anthropology and archaeology and science, right? So scientific generation, um, let's say that their scientific generation at the time is 15 years, right? And so if you've got, 100 years in that cave, then you've got 6 or 7 generations that have lived in that cave. You can't get more stable than, your great, 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 great grandmother started this and you've been here since, right? So there is a lot of stability in it, and there's still a lot of movement, and there's still a lot of intermixing, right? So you can see where both ways are going to allow for that intermixing, and you can also see where both ways are going to allow for stability. And you can have either one and have less stability. You can have a migratory group that is their migratory path is larger and they carry their home with them, right? You can have a collector group that will move to an area and live there for 5 years, and then move to another area and live there for 5 years, and then move to another area and live there for 5 years, right? So you can have instability of space in both of these as well. The one thing that you are never going to get is isolation in Homo sapiens. We don't isolate. We love each other too much. We like having each other over for tea and a little fun too much. It's not really off topic. It's not one we're discussing so much today, but no, there is not. So the question is there anything to Black folks claiming to be the original Native Americans, or is this off topic? So again, when people talk about out of Africa theory being debunked, out of Africa theory hasn't been debunked. What has been debunked is a singular exodus or a singular movement out of Africa like 100,000 years ago, and then everybody, isolated everywhere and kind of almost speciated everywhere, which is where we get that race theory, which all of that's been debunked. But we do all start in Africa. Our current knowledge for Turtle Island Indigenous is that everybody outside of Africa, except for Indigenous Australians, leaves the last common ancestor of everybody outside of Africa is roughly 50,000 years ago. And they leave the Levant area roughly 50,000 years ago, probably as a larger group. It's a mitochondrial line, so it might be a mother and 10 daughters, right? And they leave with their husbands, right? And so, as they're moving and they maybe get to 2 or 300, they start breaking up. And as they're moving along, current knowledge for Turtle Island Indigenous people is that, let's start with the fact that there's the Cerruti mastodon find currently, which is in San Diego, and 30,000 bones. And it indicates that erectus made it here before Homo sapien did, and that Homo erectus actually speciated here, which into another new species, which we do not know of. I believe through indigenous knowledge and through finds that we have found in the past, though they are unlikely to be proven or found again because, the grave robbing of early archaeology. But it is documented that we have roughly 27 giant skeletons found across the world. And most of them are here in the Turtle Islands. And when we look at Florensis, the hobbit species, and we look at Lunzonensis, the dwarf species of Homo, we do see that both of those are a product of island dwarfism. The opposite of island dwarfism is island giganticism. Island dwarfism happens when you're in a small space with a few large predators and small amount of food. Island giganticism happens when you're in a large space with large predators and a large amount of food, which we all know that's the Americas, right? So when we look at that, I believe that that species of Homo erectus is probably the giant. Giants are 7 to 9 foot tall. We still see people today between 7 and 9 foot tall. We call it giganticism today. It does still happen. So we're not talking like 30-foot tall giants. We're just talking, taller than your average human. Uh, so when we look at the earliest finds of Homo sapien in Turtle Island, we see 33,000 years ago was the current oldest, and it's in a cave in the southern tip of Mexico. When we're looking at the migration of sapien, if we're looking at that 50,000 years, 50,000 years ago, uh, last common ancestor leaving the Levant area, we're seeing that in Turtle Island indigenous people, we see that there is 0.02 to 0.03% Denisovian DNA, which tells us that they mixed with the Denisovians for roughly 10,000 years is the estimate that geneticists have come up with. And so that tells us that between that 50,000 years ago, last common ancestor out of Africa, of everybody outside of Africa again, except for the indigenous Australians, that those who eventually ended up in Turtle Island spent about 10,000 years ago, or 10,000 years of that mixing with Denisovians and getting Denisovian DNA, a unique DNA that is only seen in Southeast Asia and in the islands of the South Pacific and in Australia. So when we see people coming over, that southern boat route is starting to look like the earliest boat route we have. When we see that the people in Turtle Island not only have that unique Denisovian DNA showing 10,000 years outside of Africa, mixing with Denisovians before they get to the Turtle Islands, we also see that the Cerruti Macedon site showing that Homo erectus species, it looks like we mixed with that species when we got here, because we also here in Turtle Island have a unique ghost species in our DNA. Ghost species is something that we see. Hold on a second, Saba. It's something that we see a fingerprint of in our DNA, but we don't have the full genome of that species. And so if Erectus makes it here and speciates here, like Erectus makes it everywhere else and speciates and gets Neanderthals and Denisovians, then when we get here, we would have enveloped that species that had speciated here, again, supporting many indigenous stories of being created here, or, coming to life here, basically. We would have enveloped them here, and then this makes us completely unique. So Turtle Island indigenous DNA is completely unique in the fact that it not only has Denisovian DNA, but it has a ghost species that's not seen anywhere else. We also can see that there's backwards migration from Turtle Island into Siberia, because the X1 mitochondrial DNA starting here, the X2 mitochondrial DNA in Siberia is a daughter DNA of the X1 mitochondrial DNA. Homo sapiens are all from Africa, but by the time Turtle Island indigenous people get to Turtle Island, they are no longer by anyone's standards African. If they are, then white Europeans are African too. That's the only way that works, because Turtle Islanders have been here longer than people have been in Britain or Northwest Europe. So sapiens have been in the Turtle Islands longer than sapiens have been in Britain or Northwest Europe, right? So we're all originally African at some point, but by the time we got here, we weren't. The unique ghost species says that we're not. And actually, Northern Europeans don't have a unique ghost species. Northern Europeans only get there starting at like 30,000 years ago, in some places 10,000 years ago. And Northern Europeans have Neanderthals, and most Africans have Neanderthal too. So Northern Europeans are closer to being African than Turtle Island indigenous people are to being I get the why. Kind of, it ignores so much. And it's not true, you know. We are definitely unique to this space. We have definitely adapted in this space, right? Well, and with this, Jenny, yes, I have been hearing about the TikTok beef. Well, I got drug in a couple times. Like, I'm trying to stay out of it. I don't like to do TikTok beefs. That's not what I'm here for. But yeah, no, I've seen it. And I just have to say, sure, go to court and fight for your land back. Let's see how well you do, because it hasn't been doing us any good, and the Europeans documented us as being here, right? Like, sure, try it. Like, how's it going for you, right? Absolutely. Did that explain it in a way that you can carry on to others and give it in a way that is fully understood? And I'm only saying that because well, I don't really got it, but I'm getting there, and I want to make sure that what you're talking about is their mentality, not what I was trying to explain to you. That you actually that did come across in a way that was understandable. I am not often. I mean, like I feel sometimes like I'm really not understandable, and so I want to make sure that what I was explaining came across in a way that and not just understood, but that you can explain it, that you can carry it on so that you can defend or speak when you need to of those things. If not, please let me know and I'll do my best or ask a specific question and I'll do my best to explain that aspect of it. But by all genetic evidence, we have unique DNA here in Turtle Island. It does not mean that we didn't originally come from Africa, but none of us have been there for minimum 50,000 years. And we do have a species in us that speciates here that is unique to here that never saw Africa. So we are absolutely unique here. And we also have a DNA here that is not found anywhere else, the mitochondrial X1 DNA, which is not found anywhere else. So all of these things tell us that no, right? Okay, perfect, perfect. And then I would say a lot of people will do the Olmec heads. The Olmec heads are phenotypically Mayan. When you look at the Olmec heads and you put Mayan people next to them, current Mayan people without admixture, they look exactly like the Olmec heads. A lot of people want to say the Solutreans. The Solutreans are from the Iberian Peninsula. They're not African, they're European. So that's basically saying that the Europeans came over here. So if somebody is like, Africa came here first and it's all Africa, um, because the Solutreans, you can tell them the Solutreans are from the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula was not black. The Moors actually aren't even. Like the Moors are actually Arabian that came in and took over the Iberian Peninsula in the 1400s. So the Solutreans are not black or not African at this time. Most skin color is relatively dark. Um, that those two, and then Mansu Musa is the king that they like to say came over here. Mansu Musa was an Islamic king, and he documented everything he did, and he never left. Well, he went to Mecca, but he traveled all over Africa and Arabia. He didn't come here. There's a predecessor of Mansa Musa that they like to say, and the predecessor of Mansa Musa left Africa with 300 people in the 1300s, 1200s. In the 1200s, left Africa with 300 people and never returned. And they say that he got here and landed here. We were 80 million people minimum. Well, okay, so 50 million is the minimum, 100 million is the maximum of the amount of people on Turtle Island when the Europeans arrived in Turtle Island. There is no way you go from 300 to 80 million, 50 million at this low estimate. Not even the 10 million that is the estimate of the Taino people, or the 2 million that is the lowest estimate of the Taino people. Even if you see that that group of 300 landed in the Taino or in the islands of the South Pacific, you're not going to get the 2 million people that the Taino people were out of 300 people in a couple of hundred years. It just doesn't work like that. So even that, there's just absolutely no way. All of the arguments that they have for it, none of them are logical or make sense. And all of the DNA evidence and all of the archaeological evidence and all of the physical evidence points completely different. They like to use the Inca mummies and the Maya mummies, and they like to use the fact that there's some dreadlocks in the, not Mayan mummies, I'm sorry, Peruvian mummies. They like to use the fact that there's dreadlocks or micro braids. This might pause me for a second, but we're going to go ahead and show a picture really quick. Sorry about my hand in front of you, YouTube. Did I not have them on here? One, two, three, four. Okay, I apologize. I do not have those on my phone, but I do have them on my computer. Let me show you something really quick. We were going over actually this yesterday. We were talking about the hair in people yesterday, and we were talking a little bit about some of the mummies. We have Nazca mummies, and then we have like so here is Olmec head in the back. And as you can see with this, if you look at the bottom, you see that this is straight hair. And the way that this hair is absolutely straight. Um, Looking at, these are the Nazca mummies. And looking at these pictures, you can look at the hair itself at the tips. So if they start bringing in mummies to you, you can look at the hair itself and the tips and go, well, they've got dreadlocks. You can look at this and you can see that this is absolutely straight hair. This is not tightly coiled hair. And some of them you can absolutely see just how coarse that the hair is. Sorry, I have like a lot of pictures on this because we went over this kind of yesterday a little bit, and we went over hairstyles yesterday, and I'm trying to. I know I have the girl with braided hair somewhere, and I'm trying to find the girl with all the braids. There she is. Okay, so this is the micro braids that they're talking about. And as you can see at the tips of these micro braids, that is not only ultra straight hair, but it is the ultra coarse hair that we have been like that Columbus stated our hair was, because he stated and all the early explorers stated that our hair was very straight and very thick and very coarse. And so you can see even with this that her hair is extremely straight at the end. There is no tight coil to this hair. So all of this stuff that they have that states that it was Africans that were here when Columbus landed, or people that were phenotypically black that were here when Columbus landed. Uh, there's no proof that they have that is not already disproven. There's no claims that have not already been disproven. Uh, for me, and this is one thing that I typically tell people when this comes up, um, my direct maternal line ends with my grandmother, Flindra, who was an escaped slave. I know through DNA testing that her family line comes from the Sudan. Um, this discounts the Middle Passage. This says that the transatlantic slave trade never happened. So when people are sitting here going, the people that Columbus found were black, and the resulting Native Americans are the mix of the black people that Columbus found and the white Europeans. And so therefore they're white Europeans, which I have heard people state. When people are talking about that, what they're doing is they're giving the colonists a pass, right? They're saying that the Atlantic slave trade never happened. They're saying that the Middle Passage never happened. They're saying that children weren't stolen, that people weren't stolen from Africa. And so they're kind of giving the Europeans a pass, not just stealing somebody else's identity, not trying to erase another person's identity, but they are giving pass to the people who harmed us all, right? And they are also ignoring the resilience and the beauty of the people who were victims of the transatlantic slave trade. They're also ignoring the fact that you can actually trace, they traced Ramses the Great, Ramses the Second, Ramses the Great, to people here in the Turtle Islands, like to not to Turtle Islanders, but to Black people here in the Turtle Islands who were brought over in the slave trade, right? So, or whose ancestors were. So, like, when they're doing that, they're ignoring all the evidence that states that absolutely Black Americans were brought over here from Africa, most times unwilling. Not, I mean, within the last couple hundred years, there's a lot of people who have come over here willingly from Africa, right? But that they're erasing the transatlantic slave trade. Africa themselves states the transatlantic slave trade happened. Africa themselves states, we miss you. Like, we're so sorry you were stolen. We didn't give you up, right? Even in places of slavery in Africa, what we're looking at is pre chattel slavery versus chattel slavery. And pre chattel slavery isn't, it's a period, it's a term, it's not a lifelong thing, and it doesn't pass to your children, right? And so, uh, when we look at that, we have to understand that it, in those cases where we talk about African people selling their own people to Europeans, what we're looking at is people not thinking that they're selling people who weren't coming back. They are participating already in a slave trade, but the slave trade is a different slave trade. It is not the chattel slavery slave trade that the Europeans are utilizing. And the Europeans are able to utilize that chattel slavery because the Europeans identify anybody else as less than human, really. Whereas most slavery prior to this does not identify that. Everywhere has slavery. Chattel slavery is a whole different thing. We still have slavery today in the US. The 13th Amendment is a form of slavery, actually, because it frees everybody technically, but then it says unless. So when we go into the prison system, this is a form of pre chattel slavery. This is indentured servitude, right? That does not mean indentured servants are chattel slaves. There's a whole different thing between the chattel slavery of the US and what happened with indentured servitude. But currently within the US, we have indentured servitude, which is a form of slavery, just not chattel slavery. And it is a form of slavery that does not pass through generation. It is a form of slavery that is not inheritant, whereas chattel slavery is an inherited form of slavery. Africa did not have an inherited form of slavery any more than Europe had prior to this. So when African people were selling their people, they weren't selling somebody to disappear forever. They were selling somebody for 5 years. They were selling somebody until they earned their way out. They weren't selling somebody's grandchildren. They were selling a prisoner of war, right? And so many times they thought these people would be coming home. And Africa itself says this. Many places in Africa state, we would welcome you home. You were loved and you were lost, and we're sorry for that loss, right? So it really discounts so much. That those are my issues with it. Not only does it really erase so much, and it really Jesus Christ, I mean, we are the only people in this place that don't get any recognition for even being here, right? Like, we have to say we're still alive on a regular basis. We're something else, like like here's another person coming in to just decide that we don't exist anymore, right? Like, what the fuck, right? So not only is it kind of just doubling down on the shit that the colonialists have done, not only is it continuing the erasure that just is so deliberate, not only is it continuing the genocide that is so deliberate, is also ignoring what happened to their own ancestry, what the tragedy that befell, the resilience of their own grandmothers and grandfathers, the powerful indigeneity of Africa. Africa's indigeneity is the oldest indigeneity. We can root all of our stories really from African indigeneity. All of us across the globe have a world tree, and that starts with the Boab tree in South Africa. Like, we can really see, and it really kind of just ignores all of that. It really is tragic for everybody involved, right? It's tragic for everybody involved. Chattel slavery is a European thing. So what we're looking at is that chattel slavery is outside of the US, right? It's not just in the US. The Dutch had chattel slavery. The Spaniards had chattel slavery. Like chattel slavery is a European thing. So pretty much any European nation, not all of them, but many of them participate in chattel slavery. The US is just the last to stop participating in chattel slavery. And even when they stopped participating in chattel slavery, they then switched it to indentured servitude. So it's not it's not unique to the US. It is unique to Europe and to the descendants of Western thought, right? It is unique to the thought process of Western thought, and that's probably true. But I do know it's Europeans coming to the Turtle Islands is where chattel slavery starts. Um, I'm not exactly sure which European nation starts chattel slavery, to be honest, but you're probably right. It is probably the Portuguese. I have seen some stuff that talks about the first slaves here in the United States, or the first Black people that were brought here to the United States were brought here by Portuguese slave traders. So absolutely makes sense. I'm not exactly sure myself exactly what European country starts it. I just do know that it starts with that idea. It goes along with that manifest destiny and doctrine of discovery idea. Both of these things state that people that aren't Christian aren't human, basically. And they translate that into those who are darker of skin have the mark of Cain when it's still a biblical thing. The mark of Cain, his son Ham, was marked in the Bible, and they not believed. I'm sure they didn't believe. They just decided to tell everybody that having darker skin was that mark. And so they used that to say that they were chosen by God to be enslaved, basically, and less, basically, because God had turned his back on them, basically. And I do know that it starts within the European Christian nations, but I do not know like which one it actually starts in, right? Was it practiced in the same form of European land, though? If you mean in Europe itself, not in that form to my knowledge. That does not mean it wasn't. It just is to my knowledge, not in that form. Slavery has been around at least 10,000 years. Slavery is something that we see when we see that, well, maybe not even that long, maybe more like 4 or 5,000 years, right? So our first instances of seeing slaves, hieroglyphics are hieroglyph can't talk. Hieroglyphics are our first show of slave, our first documentation of enslaved people. Um, it's not easy to really tell somebody's been enslaved in the fossil record. Uh, unless you're finding somebody that's got like a chain around them or something like that, and that doesn't necessarily mean enslavement. Maybe it means prison. Um, but our first documentation is in ancient Egypt in the hieroglyphics. But that slavery again is a different slavery. That slavery is more akin to indentured servitude. So slavery prior to chattel slavery again is one of those styles of slavery where in a raid or in a war or due to debt or due to any number of things, you're sentenced to enslavement. You can even volunteer yourself for this period of time. Gladiators would volunteer themselves for a period of time so that their money would go to their families, right? And it is not inheritance. So if I go to prison, or if I steal bread, this is indentured servitude in England, right? If I steal bread and I get sentenced to indentured servitude in the colonies, my children are not indentured servants. I am. Any child that I have is born out from underneath the stigma of that indentured servitude. And the same thing is happening in all slavery prior to chattel slavery. It is the Vikings will capture people and bring them home, and they will be slaves, and they'll win their freedom, or they'll earn their freedom, or somebody really thinks they're hot and they'll free them, and their children are never enslaved. You might have child slaves, but those child slaves are stolen people who are then enslaved because they're captured in war. Those who built the pyramids of Egypt were absolutely actually higher class people. Like they're not even just your laborers. Like It's actually your scholar class, your engineering class in Egypt who is building that. You're actually looking at stonemasons, people who had a high level of skill, who built the pyramids and were paid extensively for it, in beer and in bread, or beer and in beer, beer and in bread. We actually, some of our oldest examples of beer come from Egypt because we have these great not pots, but jars, where we can find the beer at the bottom, and they would brew these huge vats of beer, and that's what they would dole out as payment for the work. Um, and oftentimes you would get land and house, and stuff like that. So absolutely not built by slaves. The pyramids are absolutely not only not built by slaves, but absolutely built by Egyptians. And absolutely, you can see the progress from the steels that they used to have, which are kind of these flat, kind of grave coverings, to the step pyramid, to the bent, to the broken, to the great, right? And you can see how it comes along, and how the engineers of the time, the stonemasons of the time, had to learn and had to adjust and had to practice, right? Yes. Okay. So absolutely, Saba. So there are many lands that were 100% owned by Europeans in their own minds, that were not in Europe, that had slavery. Absolutely. And honestly, the foundation of America, or the United States, is European. This is a European country. Um, the country, not the people, definitely not the indigenous people, but the government and the country is a European country. Um, so, absolutely, even here, any plantations, and we have plantations here before, and we had chattel slavery here before the Revolutionary War too. So, but in Europe itself, I do not believe that there was chattel slavery of Europeans by Europeans. I do know that there were Europeans who would have their chattel slaves, their African slaves, um, in European countries, like the Dutch. So the Dutch had African slaves in Holland, and then they had their Dutch colonies. Um, the African slaves in Holland weren't working on like plantations because they didn't have plantations in Holland, but they were chattel slaves. But the Dutch outlawed slavery pretty early on in Holland, and continued it in the Dutch colonies, and then outlawed it in the Dutch colonies. So they outlawed it in Holland, meaning that it was in Holland beforehand, uh, but they didn't have like plantations and stuff. They just, like, had their stolen people that they would keep with them, right, and utilize in that capacity. Um, so yeah, it's chattel slavery. It's just not what we think of when we think of like big plantations or sugar mills or stuff like that. And we do see that it's more like, you might have one or two people that you own there. Um, but it's really outlawed in the European countries, within European countries' borders in mainland, really early on. You see first the Dutch outlawed in Holland, and then they outlawed in the islands. You see the British actually outlawed pretty early on. And then you see other places start to outlaw it. No, 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 that makes sense. I just had to take a couple ways around to get it right. Um, so we do see that it does kind of correlate, just not in the way that we tend to think of like big groups. Like you might have one person that is your chattel slave, right? We do see though that slavery is global. It really is. We see that slavery is still in Africa in many spaces. Chattel slavery is still in Africa in many spaces, actually, or is now in Africa in many spaces. We do see that slavery that is not chattel slavery is still here in the United States. Again, the 13th Amendment creates indentured servitude slavery. Again, not inherited slavery, but slavery that you are sentenced to for a period of time. And we absolutely see that that carries over in other spaces for a while. Like we see that late on in Britain, you could go to debtor's prison and then have to work off your debt for a period of time. We do see that apprenticeship a lot of times is a form of indentured servitude, and this is one where you can sign your own rights away. We do see that within Ireland, that the Irish themselves were kept under a pretty strict rule, in where they were pretty much indentured servants as well. They were owned by the people that owned the land, right? And didn't have the right to move, didn't have the right to leave, didn't have the right to their own things. Um, Again, the Irish were never slaves in the United States. The Irish were never even indentured servants in the United States. The Irish were indentured to the British and came to the British colonies, but they were not indentured after the Revolutionary War, because you don't send your criminals to somebody else's country, especially when that country full of your criminals already revolted against you, right? We don't see that there is indentured servitude of Irish in the United States territories after the colonies become their own country. Um, we do see that indentured servitude might go through the church. Like, my father likes to tell people that he's closer to slavery than they are, because his grandfather was a slave when he came over here. It took me a while, because I didn't meet my father until 2020 to get out what he thought he meant. And what he meant was that when my grandfather came over here in 1920, my grandfather was indentured to the church. He had signed his indenture to the church, right? So he was brought over here by the church as a servant of the church under indentureship. Again, indentured servitude is not slavery. Again, not slaves after the start of, or we're not indentured servants after the start of the colonies to, any governmental effect, right? But with the indentured servants, Erica, yeah. So indentured servants, actually, many indentured servants, many did not earn their freedom, but many actually earned their freedom, actually were able to, work off their indenture. Indentured servitude was for a period of time, generally 7 years. And that indentured servitude for that period of time, uh, if you got somebody who was a shit human being, they would tack all of your food and all of your clothing onto, oh, you mean in like Holland and stuff like that? Um, but so they might stay slaves longer than, or not slaves, they might stay indentured longer than their indentured servitude due to things like that. But again, it did translate into inheritance. And again, there was at least the premise that you could earn your way out. Uh, so with chattel slavery here in the United States, though, so first of all, a lot of people aren't aware of the fact that they tried to enslave Turtle Island Indigenous people first, right? Yeah. They tried to enslave Turtle Island Indigenous people first. And when they tried to enslave Turtle Island Indigenous people in their homeland, Turtle Island Indigenous people would melt into the woods. They'd disappear on them, or they would die, as in sit and not eat until they died, right? If they couldn't get away, they would, uh, you know, get away, right? And so, because they could not maintain that control over a people in their own homeland, and those people could get away, they went to another homeland and started stealing people from there. Because if I steal somebody from another homeland, and I steal somebody from the desert and put them in the middle of the forest, they don't know what they're doing. They've never seen this before. They don't know how to work within it, right? And they certainly have nowhere to escape to, right? They don't understand their surroundings. They don't understand the way to deal in this space. They don't understand, you know, they don't understand that moss grows on trees on the north side, right? Like, they don't understand these things because it's in a completely different environment than they've ever lived in before. And so this in and of itself kind of maintains my control over them, right? And so if I bring people from another area, that level of control increases. They can't escape. They can't go into. They can't escape home, right? And so the reasons that they started bringing people from Africa is because they couldn't keep indigenous people in the Turtle Islands enslaved. Again, they'd either escape or they would escape by starving themselves to death. And so they found that it wasn't working. And so they decided to take people from Africa. Um, there is a lot of cases, especially early on, where they would just work people to death and not feed them, not care about anything. Um, we see that later on, slavery, the transatlantic slave trade becomes outlawed before slavery becomes outlawed in the United States. This is like the Clotilde. The Clotilde is the last slave ship that comes in. Yeah, like Columbus did with the Taino, 100%. And it is actually that kind of, well, shit. Um, but we see that the Clotilde is the last ship of the slave trade because they were running the barricade, basically. And that's so what happened with the Clotilde is that after they outlawed the transatlantic slave trade in the United States, somebody decides to make a bet that they can bring back slaves underneath the radar. They go, they get a shipload, they bring them back, and in the last run, they start to get caught, and so they beach the ship and they have everybody get off. And the slaves all disappear into the swampland around this. And they actually create their own town because they're free. Right. And so they actually create their own town, and the descendants of the Clotilde still live in that town today. And the wreckage of the Clotilde is in that river. And they've actually found, or not that river, that bay, like it's a bay area. And they've actually found the wreckage of the Clotilde. But the Clotilde is the last slave ship because it is after the outlawing of the transatlantic slave trade before the outlawing of slavery. So there's like a 20-year period between the outlawing of the transatlantic slave trade, as in transporting people here, and the outlawing of slavery itself. And in that 20-year period, the only new slaves that you're getting are slaves that you've bred. And so this is where you start to see that upping of breeding of slaves. Though they were always breeding slaves pretty horrifically, and they were there is always this work to death thing going on. Many places. Uh, all of this is really horrific to talk about, and please understand that I'm trying to ensure that I'm talking about it with the greatest amount of respect for the ancestors lost, as well as for the descendants who are still suffering from the trauma of it. And if it comes across in any different way, I apologize, and I encourage correction. Uh, they found it less expensive to just continue to import people. And so what they would do is, instead of feeding them and clothing them, they would just work them to death and import new ones. Um, so we absolutely see that very early on. Um, it's just horrific in all its means, right? We do see, though, that slavery prior to this is absolutely slavery that is global, and it's not the slavery that we understand when we talk about slavery, because when we talk about slavery, we talk about chattel slavery. We don't talk about the slavery that's still going on globally. We don't talk about the slavery that's still going on here in the United States, or at least so. The reason that I call the 13th Amendment slavery, but I don't call indentured servitude slavery, is because, and I do distinguish that indentured servitude is a type of slavery. It's just not, uh, yes, it is, Emma. There is absolutely true that there are were slave breeding farms in the United States. The reason that I distinguish, okay, so indentured servitude is absolutely a form of slavery, but it is not chattel slavery. This needs to be distinguished because you get a lot of people who are like, oh, it's not that bad. My ancestors came over from Ireland and they were indentured servants, so they were slaves too, right? That's a crock of shit. That slavery is a different form of slavery. Um, and then there's chattel slavery, and then the 13th Amendment. And the reason that I'm differentiating the 13th Amendment as still slavery, even though it is indentured servitude, is because of the wording of the 13th Amendment. Because the wording of the 13th Amendment states that people shall not be owned unless, right? So the 13th Amendment is put into place specifically to give slaveholders a way to continue to own slaves. It is still not chattel slavery. It is still an indentured servitude form. And so it is absolutely different than the chattel slavery, but it is put in place completely to give the southern states the ability to still own slaves on some level, right? So It is still so recent. A lot of people like to say get over it about everything, right? Like, and so many times they say get over it about shit that's still going on. I mean, we do this in personal lives, we do this in public, we do this what we deem as politics, so they shouldn't be politics. Like I've been told, somebody asked me a while ago or told me, I really wish you'd get over what, this person did to you, because we're all paying for the price of you, not having, still being upset over what this person did to you. And it's like, well, I can't get over something that's ongoing. It's impossible to get over something that's happening today. I can't get over something in the middle of it. It's not over. There's no get over of something that's not being over. Right? If you are still hurting me today, what the fuck am I supposed to be getting over? The fact that you did the same thing yesterday, but you're still doing it today. It's not over for you. So why is it supposed to be over for me? Get over it, but you're doing it. Get over you punching me in the face as you're punching me in the face. Maybe you should get over doing it, right? So we absolutely see a lot of that. We see a lot of the get over it, on so many different levels. And it's like, it's impossible to get over something that isn't over. It has to be over for me to get over it. And as long as it is continuing, it's not over. So what am I supposed to get over? Right. Um, and that is very much, and like we take this back when we got onto this topic because we were talking about whether or not Turtle Island Indigenous people are uniquely Indigenous to Turtle Island, which they absolutely are, right? And we take it back to, that thought process. We know if we are Turtle Island Indigenous and many of our accomplices and allies, that we are the only group here that is unseen, right? How do we get over the fact that you've decided we're dead? How do you get over the fact that you won't even put us on 2016 or what was it, 2020 voting, where it was like white Americans, Black Americans, Asian Americans, Mexican Americans, something else, right? Like, how do you get over the fact that you don't fucking see us? How do you get over something that's still going on? And we are the only group here that nobody sees, right? Like, we're even out there struggling to ensure other people are seen constantly, right? So, why are we the only one that nobody sees? We were talking, I've seen a couple articles about taking indigenous exhibits out of museums because of the fact that it treats us like we're not here anymore. It treats us like a science project, right? Which I think is totally real, right? We put indigenous people in museums and we put indigenous thought in museums and we act like it doesn't exist, but it still exists. Um, I love the uplift that we have of African voices, of Black voices in the United States. I am a huge proponent. Again, that's where my direct maternal line ends. I have always put a lot into, trying to ensure that forward movement, trying to be, a part of that, knowing what the effects are and everything else and the study of it. Um, I really support, that I support reparations. I really support those things. I'm really sometimes disappointed that there is all of this support, but the people whose land it is aren't even seen as being here, right? Where is all of the support for those of us who've been here longer than 528 years, who are still fighting against the effects of colonization, even more so than many Black people are? I mean, and that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of trauma and that there's not a lot of racism and there's not a lot of stuff, right? Uh, but Indigenous people, like, we don't allow half the Indigenous people from this country into this country. We imposed a fucking border in a space that didn't have a border and then told people they had to stay on one side of it, even though this is their homeland, right? So how do we, you know, when do we acknowledge that? When do we acknowledge that Indigenous people exist? When do we acknowledge that, right? Yeah. And so that for me is one of those, I'm like, I'm still going to support and still love, and I still absolutely want to ensure, that these happens. I still really want to make sure that we also uplift us, right? Like not just us, but like uh, that we also uplift the indigenous voices here that deserve that understanding, right? The first word in that, the E word, is actually considered a slur. Inuit is better, Inupek. Um, just so we know, hi, just so it's aware, right? But yes, it is true that they are all actually well, okay, so our current knowledge is like I was saying before, that there's probably about 3 or 4 different migrations over. It is thought that many of the Inupek people actually are one of those last migrations over, and that they follow the Kelp Highway over. Um, Coming from the Thule group at roughly 7 to 8,000 years ago. Sometimes we have conversation, or there is conversation of that. There is other conversation out there. We also know that, like, the Dene language group goes from the southern tip of Mexico. That does not mean that everybody speaks Dene. It means it's the root language of all of these groups. The root language of all of these groups is the same as the Dene root language, and it goes from the southern tip of Mexico into the Great Plains and then starts over at the top of California and up into Alaska. And so we see that these, and no apologies needed. I didn't take it as an insult because so many people do not know. We all have to learn those things, right? I'm learning all the time that there are words that are considered slurs for other people that I need to correct myself and make sure I'm saying more correctly or saying differently or things like that. So, because like I like to say, we all have rooms to accomplish for other people. Okay, little one. I'm gonna go. My dog is yelling at me. I will see you guys all later. I'll try and come on tonight. Actually, I haven't been on in the night in a while, and I wanted to try and get on in the night. But I will see you guys all later. Take care. Much love. And remember that we are all worthy. We all have room to be accomplices to others, and that that hurt and pain you feel is because if you can look at this shit show and not feel hurt and pain, there might actually be something wrong. I mean, depression is natural when everybody else around you is being harmed. So remember your worth. Much love to you all, and I will see you guys later. Much love, YouTube. I will see you guys all later. Yes, I will take you out. I will take you out. Let's go. Let's go.